Let's begin with a man who looked at modern warfare, glanced at the tanks, the guns, the explosions and said, "Cool story, I brought a sword." His full name, because of course it's a novel in itself, was John Malcolm Thorpe Fleming Churchill. Born in 1906 in British Ceylon, modern-day Sri Lanka, Churchill came into the world already sounding like he was invented by a drunk screenwriter halfway through a fantasy script, and while he wasn't related to that Churchill Winston, he more than made up for it in theatrical flair. Now, most soldiers prepare for war by learning how to shoot straight and march in a straight line. Jack Churchill? He preferred longbows, bagpipes and a massive Scottish broadsword called a claymore. Why? Because Jack didn't just fight wars, he performed them. If war was hell, Jack figured he might as well make it historically themed. This is the man who would earn the nickname Mad Jack, not because he lost his mind, but because he was clearly operating on a completely different setting than everyone else. You know how every friend group has that one guy who always takes things too far on purpose? Jack was that guy, except his idea of too far was storming enemy positions with medieval weapons in the middle of the 20th century. But before he became a walking anachronism in World War II, Jack was already a man of eccentric tastes. He wasn't just a casual hobbyist when it came to archery. No, he was an international-level archer. He represented Britain in tournaments and could hit targets with the kind of accuracy that made squirrels nervous. And while most people might take up bagpipes as a regrettable childhood experiment that ended with a broken window and disappointed neighbours, Jack mastered them. He loved piping traditional Scottish tunes, even though he wasn't Scottish. Honestly, he just seemed to love any activity that made people around him ask, "Wait, is he serious?" And yes, the sword. Not a ceremonial thing, not some prop to look fancy in parades. This was a fully functional, battle-ready blade that Jack carried into active war zones. Because bullets are effective, but a sword says, "I've made some very specific life choices, and I'm ready to commit." When people later asked why he carried a sword, Jack replied with classic Mad Jack logic. "In my opinion, sir, any officer who goes into action without his sword is improperly dressed." Improperly dressed. Like war was a formal dinner party and someone forgot their cufflinks. It wasn't an act. He wasn't trying to go viral in a time before TikTok. This was just Jack. He genuinely believed that style, bravery, and a hint of medieval madness could still win the day, even against machine guns. And bizarrely, sometimes it worked. But Jack wasn't just eccentric for fun. Underneath the kilt, metaphorically though possibly literally we'll never know, he was smart, capable, and wildly competent. He graduated from the Royal Military College at Sandhurst and was commissioned into the Manchester Regiment. He had the training and the discipline of a proper British officer, but layered on top was the swagger of a man who probably spent his teenage years asking, "But what if I did bring a crossbow to fencing practice?" Even his personal philosophy seemed ripped from a book of inspirational quotes written by a Viking with impulse control issues. He once said, "People are less likely to shoot at you if you're being weird." And to be fair, he had a point. If you're a German soldier and a guy in a kilt playing bagpipes is running at you with a sword, your brain probably skips aim and fire and goes straight to reconsider life choices. By the time World War II broke out, Jack Churchill had already shaped himself into a man who seemed surgically designed to confuse, baffle, and terrify his enemies. And that was before the first arrow flew. So while other soldiers packed rations, bullets, and maybe a lucky photo of home, Jack packed a bow, a sword, a set of bagpipes, and a complete disregard for modern warfare. The result? A man who didn't just go to war. He brought vibes. And thus begins the legend of the last great warrior who charged into machine gun fire with the music of the Highlands in his ears, the wind in his kilt, and a sword in his hand. Before Mad Jack Churchill became the sword-wielding legend of World War II, he lived a life that would make even an action hero say, "Okay, maybe tone it down a bit." Because of course the man who would later march into battle playing bagpipes didn't exactly spend the 1930s quietly knitting sweaters and feeding pigeons in a park. No, he spent his time doing what he did best, confusing everyone. defying expectations, and living like adrenaline was a food group. Let's rewind to the 1920s and early 1930s. Jack had just graduated from the Royal Military College at Sandhurst and received his commission in the Manchester Regiment, a British infantry unit. Now, you might assume that fresh out of training military officers would spend their early years diligently polishing boots and shouting at clouds. Jack, however, took a more creative approach to early military life. He became a motorcycle daredevil, and not in the controlled, helmeted, here's a ramp and a safety crew sort of way. No, this was the roaring 1920s in British India. Jack was stationed there, and he treated the countryside like his own personal racetrack. He would tear across the Indian landscape on his bike, sometimes riding on one wheel, sometimes dodging elephants, and very possibly inventing extreme sports decades ahead of schedule. The military didn't quite know what to do with him. One moment he'd be delivering dispatches like a proper officer. The next, he'd be performing accidental test runs for what would one day become the X Games. When a superior officer once scolded him for reckless behavior, Jack allegedly responded, "I didn't crash, sir. I just landed differently." But motorcycles were only half the fun. Jack also became one of the first Westerners to surf on the Indian coast. This was back when surfing wasn't a global sport. It was still a mostly Polynesian tradition, with few outsiders having even seen it. But there was Jack, turning the Arabian Sea into his personal wave park, standing upright on a board, while local fishermen watched in confusion and probable awe. And naturally, when he wasn't surfing, he was learning the bagpipes. Why bagpipes? Why not? He wasn't Scottish, but that never stopped him. It's said he practiced obsessively, even when people begged him not to. Some reports suggest that he would play loudly and proudly during odd hours of the day, just to remind people that yes, Jack Churchill was always nearby, and your peace was temporary. Then came his transition into acting, because apparently Jack wasn't satisfied with being a motorcycle surfing, bagpipe blasting military officer. In the mid-1930s he returned to Britain and promptly started appearing in films as an extra. But not just any extra, he played an archer. Because if you're Jack Churchill, you don't play the innkeeper or the nobleman sipping wine. You pick up a bow, put on tights and head straight for the action. His most notable appearance was in the 1938 fantasy film The Thief of Baghdad. In it, Jack played one of the Sultan's archers, bow in hand, quiver slung, scowling into the mystical distance like he was born for it. And honestly, he kind of was. He didn't just look the part, he was the part. He was, at that point, already one of the top archers in Britain and a skilled marksman with both traditional and war bows. While other actors practiced looking cool, Jack practiced piercing targets with terrifying accuracy. And let's just take a moment to consider the timeline here. While the rest of Europe was gearing up for one of the most devastating wars in human history, Jack Churchill was surfing, doing stunts, and casually moonlighting as a medieval fantasy character. It's like history gave him a script labeled supporting military officer, and he scribbled it out and wrote chaotic neutral legend in crayon. It wasn't all cinematic glamour though. Even in his pre-war years, Jack was a man of routine and discipline. He just applied that discipline to the weirdest possible hobbies. He was known for practicing archery in his backyard for hours, tinkering with arrow design, and working out like he was preparing to personally refight the 100 Years' War. He wasn't just playing dress-up with the past. He was actively living it. Most people spend their 20s figuring out who they are. Jack Churchill spent his carving out a persona that made absolutely no sense by conventional standards, but somehow made perfect sense for him. A thrill-seeking soldier with a flair for performance, a taste for danger, and a musical instrument that sounds like a goose caught in a wind tunnel. So when World War II finally did roll around, Jack didn't have to reinvent himself. He was already fully formed. Part soldier, part showman, part medieval action figure. When you're not busy preparing for war, you might as well become a background archer in a fantasy film. And if you're Jack Churchill, that's not even the weirdest part of your resume. When World War II erupted in 1939, the world geared up for an industrial-scale apocalypse. Nations brought tanks, bombers, automatic rifles, flamethrowers, and more strategy than a chess tournament held inside a gunpowder factory. Armies trained in trench tactics, blitzkriegs, and urban warfare. But then came Jack Churchill, reporting for duty looking like he'd just wandered out of a Scottish epic and into the wrong century. While other British soldiers arrived at the battlefield carrying Enfield rifles and standard-issue steel helmets, Jack showed up carrying three things that made his commanding officers do a double take and his enemies question reality: a longbow, a set of Scottish bagpipes, and a broadsword. Let's be clear, this wasn't a decorative sword or some ceremonial thing to wave at parades. This was a full-sized claymore, the kind of blade you'd expect to find on the back of a Viking or in the arms of William Wallace yelling about freedom. And Jack didn't keep it tucked away for emergencies, he used it actively, in combat, in the 1940s. This wasn't cosplay, this was combat flair. His officers, understandably, were baffled, but Jack wasn't trying to be funny, he was just playing war by his own very dramatic rulebook. His philosophy: modern warfare might be efficient but it lacked style, so while bullets whizzed and bombs dropped, Jack Churchill made sure he brought a little medieval spice to the battlefield. And here's where things go from quirky to legendary. Jack Churchill is credited with the only confirmed longbow kill in World War II. Yes, you read that correctly. In 1940, during a military operation in France, Jack and his unit were setting up an ambush against a group of advancing German soldiers. Most men readied their rifles. Jack knocked an arrow, he waited, he aimed, and then thwip, a German soldier fell dead, shot through with a longbow arrow, courtesy of a man who apparently believed the Geneva Convention could be bent slightly for theatrical purposes. Historians debate whether this was the only longbow kill in WWII, but if there were others, they were probably done by someone who also had a collection of wizard robes and a pet raven. For all intents and purposes, Jack was it, the last known archer of modern warfare. And the best part? Jack didn't just bring the bow for that one shot. He carried it as part of his regular combat gear, along with arrows, real arrows. Because what's the point of a war if you're not lugging around 14th century artillery just in case? Let's not forget the bagpipes either. Jack had a habit of playing them before and after battles, not gently, not in private. He would stand tall, sometimes in plain view of the enemy, and let the haunting wail of Scottish folk songs carry across the battlefield. It was either psychological warfare or personal karaoke, possibly both. Imagine being a German soldier, preparing for a firefight, only to hear the distant sound of bagpipes drifting across the smoke. Then, through the haze, you see a man in British uniform drawing a sword like it's Swelthine 99 and yelling a battle cry straight out of a Tolkien fever dream. It's not just confusing, it's existentially confusing. Are we in the wrong war? Did we time travel? Is that man playing music while charging us? Jack Churchill didn't believe in suppressive fire. He believed in dramatic entrances and medieval justice. Even among the notoriously disciplined ranks of the British Army, Jack stood out. Officers often didn't know whether to discipline him or promote him. His flair for the dramatic was matched only by his competence. He wasn't reckless. He was strategic. He just happened to execute those strategies like a rogue paladin dropped into a modern battlefield. And yes, he faced danger like everyone else. He was shot at, bombed, and ambushed multiple times. But where others ducked and covered, Jack often stood up straighter, probably to get a better angle for his next pipe solo. During one mission in the early war years, he led his men into battle while playing Will Ye No Come Back Again on the pipes. As bullets flew past him, he calmly played on, his claymore strapped to his side. That was his version of a pump-up playlist. Why use a radio when you are the playlist? And while it's easy to laugh at the sheer theatricality of it all, Jack wasn't playing a character. He was simply being himself, a man who believed courage didn't have to be boring, and that fear could be fought off with steel, sound, and style points. So as the world collapsed into a new era of mechanized war, Mad Jack Churchill stood defiant, an ancient soul in a modern conflict, armed with steel and sound, bringing a sword to a gunfight, and occasionally winning. There's courage, there's madness, and then there's whatever Jack Churchill was doing on the battlefield, which was something like live-action role-play with real consequences. By the time World War II had picked up steam, Mad Jack wasn't just the quirky officer with the sword. He was out in the thick of it, slicing through Europe's most dangerous combat zones, literally with a broadsword in one hand, bagpipes under his arm, and a grin that said, "This is going to confuse the hell out of someone today." Let's start with his campaign in France, where Jack was posted with the British Expeditionary Force. The Germans were sweeping across Europe with terrifying efficiency, and Churchill's unit found itself in a precarious ambush scenario near a village. Most officers would hunker down, whisper orders, and radio for artillery support. Jack, on the other hand, calmly drew his sword, looked at his men, and essentially said, "Let's ruin their day." What followed was one of the most surreal charges in modern military history. Jack led his men in a full-on assault with his sword raised high, not holstered, not dangling passively on his belt, in his hand, out front, like he was personally storming a castle instead of a trench. Eyewitnesses recall the moment vividly, the glint of his sword in the smoky air, the shrill of bagpipes, because yes, he actually played the pipes before charging. And then there he was, bounding toward enemy lines like a caffeinated knight with a death wish and a soundtrack. The result? Complete and total chaos. The enemy was so stunned that they hesitated, which in war is the deadliest emotion you can experience. His men followed, inspired or maybe just too stunned to argue, and took the position with minimal casualties. Because really, what do you even do when someone charges you with a sword in 1940? It's not in the training manual. Your brain short-circuits. Is that guy playing the bagpipes? Should we shoot him or wait? Is this a dream? As one of his fellow soldiers reportedly said afterward, "It wasn't bravery, it was whatever comes after bravery. Like 4 exits past bravery, down a dirt road. Next stop, Norway." Here, Jack was part of a commando operation to raid German positions in the frozen mountainous terrain. The landscape was harsh. The enemy was well dug in. The mission was supposed to be stealthy. Naturally, Jack had other plans. Instead of sneaking up under cover of darkness, he once again played the bagpipes, this time on the beach, in full uniform, as his men disembarked. The haunting melody echoed across the fjord, alerting the Germans that something deeply weird was coming their way. Then came Jack, broadsword glinting, leading the charge through gunfire and snow like a one-man Renaissance festival with a personal vendetta. During the attack, Jack captured 42 German soldiers, not with a tank, not with grenades, with a sword and sheer intimidation. One can only imagine the confusion in those German foxholes. We're being attacked by what? By a man in a kilt with a sword and a musical instrument. It's safe to say that fear wasn't the first reaction. It was raw, unfiltered bafflement. Jack's greatest weapon may not have been his blade, it was his ability to weaponize vibe. Even during the infamous Dunkirk evacuation, Jack's energy remained unchanged. While British forces desperately retreated across chaotic beaches under constant aerial bombardment, most soldiers were praying, hiding, or trying not to get obliterated. Jack, he was reportedly seen marching calmly along the beach, playing his bagpipes, sword at his hip, acting like this was all a minor inconvenience on his way to a Sealid. German aircraft zoomed overhead, bullets sprayed the sand, and there he was, piping out March of the Cameron Men like it was Sunday morning in the Scottish Highlands. What makes it so ridiculous and so brilliant is that this wasn't some morale stunt. It wasn't filmed. There were no journalists, no photo ops. Jack did it because that's how he thought war should be fought, with courage, dignity, and dramatic flair. His men loved him, not just because he was effective, but because his sheer audacity inspired bravery. When your commanding officer charges the enemy armed with a medieval sword, you don't question it, you just follow. If nothing else, you really don't want to be the one guy who hesitated while Braveheart 2.0 ran off into glory. There's something deeply unsettling about a man playing bagpipes while charging you with a broadsword. It's like getting mugged by a musical ghost from the 1300s. And it worked, again and again. Jack's theatrics won battles, captured prisoners, and spread his legend across the ranks. For a man who charged enemy lines with a sword, played bagpipes under machine gun fire, and casually captured dozens of Germans like he was collecting Pokemon, the idea of Jack Churchill getting captured feels like the punchline to a joke. History forgot to finish. But yes, even Mad Jack had a limit, specifically the point where you've run out of arrows, bullets, backup, and presumably patience. It happened in 1944, in the rugged mountains of Yugoslavia. Jack was leading a mission alongside a team of British commandos and a local partisan group. The plan was classic Jack, bold, unexpected, and probably cooked up in the same part of the brain that stores medieval trivia and pipe music. Their goal was to raid a German-held position under the cover of night, a task they executed with their usual reckless elegance. For a while, everything worked. The element of surprise was theirs. The terrain was familiar. The enemies were confused, which was standard whenever Jack Churchill arrived with a claymore and the theme music of the Highlands. But then, things turned. The Germans counterattacked with a force that outnumbered Churchill's squad significantly. The firefight escalated into a desperate last stand. Bullets flew, cover vanished, and one by one Jack's men were taken down or forced to retreat. Eventually Jack was left alone, just him, his sword, and whatever arrows he had left rattling in his quiver like angry pencils. Even at this point, most people would have either waved a white flag or called for air support. Jack, however, decided to go full fantasy novel and kept fighting. One can imagine him crouched behind a rock, methodically firing his last few arrows into the darkness, muttering to himself about how much easier sieges were in the 1300s. But reality was closing in. He was out of arrows, out of ammunition, probably still in possession of his bagpipes, but even Jack had to admit that musical intimidation had limited tactical value against a wall of incoming German rifles. So, inevitably, the moment came. He was surrounded and captured, but not defeated. Jack Churchill didn't do defeated. What he did instead was get annoyed. When German soldiers finally took him prisoner, he didn't beg, panic, or curse. No, he just sighed, rolled his eyes, and reportedly quipped, "If it wasn't for those damn Yanks, we could have kept the war going another 10 years. Yes, that was his reaction. Not terror, not regret. Annoyance that the Americans had arrived and ruined his fun. In Jack's mind, war was something between a challenge, a theatre performance, and a game of capture the flag with higher stakes. And now it was ending, because reinforcements were actually doing their job. To be fair, Churchill's frustration was, in its own way, logical. The American forces had advanced so quickly on other fronts that the Germans had consolidated their forces in Yugoslavia. That meant more enemy troops where Jack was operating. More troops meant more resistance. More resistance meant even Jack Churchill couldn't keep winning with medieval cosplay and sheer audacity. But surrender? No, he didn't surrender. He simply ran out of medieval options. Once captured, the Germans had no idea what to make of him. This wasn't your standard British officer. He was found wearing a kilt, carrying a broadsword, and mumbling about arrows. They probably assumed he was some sort of eccentric spy, or a very confused historical reenactor who took a wrong turn at a Renaissance fair and ended up in occupied territory. As they processed him and sent him to a prison camp, one can only imagine the paperwork. Prisoner's weapon, sword. Musical instrument, bagpipes. Behavior, unnervingly cheerful. The guards didn't know whether to fear him or give him a sitcom. Even while in captivity, Jack maintained his poise. He didn't act like a defeated man. He acted like a knight temporarily delayed on a quest. He kept his spirits up, plotted his escape, because of course he did, and treated imprisonment not as punishment, but as the next weird chapter in the Mad Jack adventure hour. And while the capture itself may have ended his Yugoslavian mission, it didn't break his spirit. If anything, it gave him a new challenge, surviving captivity while maintaining maximum eccentricity. Jack Churchill's capture wasn't a failure. It was just history pressing pause on a man who really could have kept fighting indefinitely, provided someone kept restocking his arrows and occasionally retuning his bagpipes. He didn't surrender. He wasn't beaten. He just hit the point where he couldn't fire sharp sticks anymore, and even he had to admit that bagpipe solos didn't stop bullets. So yes, Jack Churchill was captured, but he wasn't conquered. Because how do you conquer a man whose idea of modern warfare was to personally turn it into a mashup of Braveheart, Lord of the Rings, and an off-key bagpipe recital? Now, let's follow what happens next. Because if you think capture slowed Jack down, just wait until you see what he does inside a prison camp. Being captured should have been the end of Jack Churchill's story. For most soldiers, a prison camp meant misery, despair, and an urgent need to not die. For Jack, it meant a new hobby, getting out, because for him, being imprisoned wasn't a punishment, it was a puzzle, an annoyance, a temporary delay on his quest to bring medieval chaos back to modern warfare. If most POWs were trying to survive, Jack was trying to win. After his capture in Yugoslavia, Jack was eventually transferred to Sachsenhausen, one of Germany's notorious concentration camps. It was built to hold political prisoners, resistance fighters, and now apparently a bagpipe-playing British officer with a fondness for sharp metal objects. Jack didn't quite fit the typical profile, and the guards must have sensed it. He reportedly remained cheerful, polite, and deeply uncooperative in exactly the way that makes you worry someone's plotting something. Spoiler, he was. Sachsenhausen wasn't a place designed for escapes. It was heavily guarded, surrounded by electrified fences, and populated with watchtowers that made any run for it a probable suicide mission. Jack took one look at that and basically said, "Challenge accepted." He teamed up with another officer, RAF pilot Bertram James, and the two of them hatched a plan that sounded less like a desperate bid for freedom and more like a deleted scene from The Great Escape, but weirder. With patience, subtlety, and absolutely no concern for what a normal prisoner should be doing, Jack and James dug a tunnel beneath a latrine block. Yes, a tunnel. From inside a prison camp, because why settle for hopeless captivity when you can go full Bugs Bunny with a shovel? After weeks of planning, they crawled through their tunnel in the dead of night, popped out the other side and began their escape. No dramatic music, no motorcycle chase, just two guys in stolen uniforms walking through the territory like they were late for a dentist appointment. It was, for a brief time, perfect. Then came the awkward part. They got caught, somewhere in northern Germany. After days on the run, the duo was picked up by a German patrol. Jack's reaction was, by all accounts, frustratingly upbeat. You'd think getting recaptured after such an elaborate escape would break a man's spirit. Jack probably saw it as a plot twist, and so back to the camps he went, this time sent to Tyrol, in the Austrian Alps, with a group of high-value Allied prisoners. It was a kind of VIP detention area, presumably with slightly better blankets and slightly worse paranoia. But Jack was, as always, unimpressed. Even surrounded by enemy guards and razor wire, his internal monologue probably read like, "This place could use an exit." By 1945, Germany was crumbling, and Allied forces were closing in. The guards at Tyrol eventually abandoned their posts, fleeing like villains at the end of a Scooby-Doo episode. For most prisoners, this meant sitting tight and waiting for liberation. Jack Churchill? Nope. Instead of waiting for a rescue party like a normal person, Jack decided he'd walk back to freedom, and not just a few miles. He hiked on foot over 150 miles through the Alps, surviving on vegetables from abandoned farms and sheer unfiltered stubbornness. That's not an escape, that's a personal side quest, and he made it. He found an American armored division in Verona, Italy, calmly reported that he was an escaped POW, and in all likelihood asked where he could get a decent cup of tea and possibly his sword back. No drama, no fanfare, just Jack Churchill, emerging from the chaos of Europe like a medieval forest spirit who'd gotten lost and decided to fight fascism on the way. Let's pause here to appreciate the sheer absurdity of it all. This man was captured, imprisoned in two different camps, escaped, got recaptured, sent to another camp, walked halfway across a collapsing continent, and then showed up looking like he'd just returned from a scenic backpacking trip. Jack Churchill could turn a POW camp into an inconvenience, like a mildly annoying layover. Other prisoners left camp with PTSD. Jack left with a few new stories, and possibly more respect for Austrian potatoes. It's not that he didn't take the war seriously, he absolutely did, but he categorically refused to let it crush his sense of agency. He didn't accept captivity as permanent. He didn't wallow. He didn't break. He planned, he plotted, and he persisted until even the enemy had to wonder if it was worth keeping him locked up at all. So yes, Jack Churchill was a prisoner, but only technically. In reality, he was just a free man who briefly misplaced the exit. For most soldiers, the end of World War II was met with tears of relief, long overdue reunions, and a deep, primal need to never hear another gunshot ever again. People went home. They took up quiet lives. They got married, started gardens, and tried to forget the noise. But Jack Churchill? No. When the dust settled, Jack took one look at peace and decided it was far too quiet. While the world sighed with exhaustion, Jack cracked his knuckles and basically asked, "Okay, what's next?" At this point, most governments would have handed the man a medal and a beach vacation. Britain, however, was still deeply entangled in the troubled post-war landscape of the Middle East, especially in British-controlled. The region was a boiling pot of rising tensions between Jews, Arabs, and the British Mandate authorities. It was a diplomatic nightmare, so naturally Jack volunteered to drop right into the middle of it, because nothing says thank you for your service quite like immediately asking for more service. So Jack packed his things, probably including his sword because why wouldn't he, and headed off to the Holy Land in 1946. He wasn't deployed as part of a formal combat unit this time. He was stationed in an intelligence and security role with the British 1st Battalion, the Highland Light Infantry. But if you thought intelligence meant paperwork and radios, you haven't been paying attention. During this post-war assignment, Churchill would once again leap headfirst into a crisis, but this time not with arrows. Instead, he used bluff, bravado, and what might generously be described as creative lying. The scene: a bomb-laden convoy was stranded in the middle of a tense city district. Jack's unit was escorting a group of Jewish medical patients and hospital staff, who were being evacuated during a surge of violence. The road they were traveling was blocked, and the convoy came under heavy fire from local militias. The trucks were pinned, the civilians trapped, ammunition was low. There were 700 people whose lives were now hanging in the balance. Most men would have radioed for backup or hunkered down. Jack Churchill grabbed a bag of explosives because, of course, someone had a spare bag of dynamite lying around and walked out into the street, alone, calm, like he was delivering mail. When he reached the enemy position, he confidently informed the attackers that he was a demolition expert and that unless they let the convoy pass, he would blow up the entire street, including everyone involved. Keep in mind, Jack had no actual plan for how to do this. He just stood there, holding a bag of death like it was a grocery sack, smiling like he was born in a pressure cooker. And it worked. The stunned militants, confronted by a single man who seemed extremely comfortable with mutual destruction, backed off. They let the convoy pass. No shots were fired. No buildings were blown up. The civilians were escorted safely to their destination. It was a war story that somehow required no combat, just nerves of steel, a face made of pure British audacity, and a complete disregard for self-preservation. Jack had once again weaponized his weirdness. Only this time, instead of medieval gear, he'd used sheer psychological warfare, because let's be honest, when a man like Jack Churchill threatens to explode a street, you believe him. The man carried a sword through Normandy. Subtlety was never his thing. This moment, while less flashy than his sword-swinging battlefield antics, might have been his finest hour. 700 lives saved not with firepower but with flair. Because at his core, Jack wasn't just a warrior, he was a showman, a strategist, a man who knew that sometimes the scariest thing on a battlefield isn't a bomb, It's a guy who looks like he'd cheerfully light one. He remained there for some time after that, navigating the chaos with his usual mixture of discipline, eccentricity, and just enough recklessness to keep his superiors on edge. And while British troops were eventually withdrawn and the mandate dissolved, Jack Churchill left the region with his reputation intact and his legend further burnished. Most soldiers retire into quiet obscurity after one war. Jack's idea of retirement was finding another war and asking if he could bring his sword again. Peace bored him. Diplomacy confused him. But a crisis, that was where Jack thrived. So while the rest of the world tried to move past the horror of the 1940s, Jack Churchill marched onward, a man who didn't just survive history. He poked it with sharp objects, played it a tune, and walked away with another ridiculous story to tell. By now, the phrase Mad Jack Churchill conjures up a very specific image: bagpipes shrieking, a broadsword flashing, Germans fleeing, and history teachers nervously fact-checking their textbooks. But beyond the battlefield theatrics and the Hollywood-level war stories, Jack was somehow also a real person, a man with daily routines, odd habits, and an energy that could only be described as chaotic neutral in a pressed uniform. To live or work near him was to inhabit a realm where logic waved a polite goodbye and eccentricity slammed through the door with a marching tune. He wasn't crazy, he just didn't believe in normal, or pants, or timetables. Let's start with the bagpipes. Jack didn't reserve them for just scaring the enemy or psyching up troops on the battlefield. No, the bagpipes were Jack's morning alarm clock of choice. Not for himself, for everyone else. He would sometimes stroll through the barracks or officers' quarters at an ungodly hour, blasting out traditional Scottish tunes with the kind of volume usually reserved for air raids. No one asked him to. No one wanted him to. But Jack believed that nothing got the blood pumping quite like Scotland the Brave being screamed into your soul at 6 a.m. And unlike a normal person who might pick a tune and stick to it, Jack had a rotating set list of ear-shattering wake-up calls, marches, laments, possibly sea shanties. It depended entirely on his mood. If the weather was nice, maybe something light. If it was raining, prepare for the sonic equivalent of a war cry. No one ever really adjusted to it. You didn't get used to Jack's mornings, you just survived them. Now let's talk about the briefcase incident. After the war, Jack worked various peacetime military jobs. One of them required him to commute via train across southern England. One day, while travelling through the countryside, the train passed a section of track near his home. It was about 2 miles away from his actual stop, but clearly much closer to his front door. So Jack did what any perfectly irrational person would do. He calmly stood up, walked to the train's window, and chucked his briefcase out, right out the window, onto the grass. With no hesitation, the stunned passengers around him stared in confused horror as he sat back down, seemingly pleased. When asked later what on earth had possessed him to yeet his luggage into a hedgerow, he replied, quite reasonably, that it would save him the trouble of carrying it all the way from the station. He just hopped off at the next stop and walked back to retrieve it, as if this was the most obvious transportation strategy in the world. And of course, this wasn't a one-time stunt. Jack was known to rely on this method regularly. Why use logic when you have reliable throwing arms, terrain familiarity, and complete disregard for British rail guidelines? Now, if you were lucky or unlucky enough to share a room with Jack during his military service, you entered a world where the usual rhythms of domestic life no longer applied. Need to sleep in? Too bad, bagpipes. Want to relax? Hope you don't mind the man across from you casually sharpening a literal sword. There were stories of Jack lying in bed, fully dressed, shoes polished, staring at the ceiling like a soldier in a fairy tale, just waiting for a dragon to slay or an alarm to sound. And despite all of this, or maybe because of it, his fellow soldiers loved him, deeply, passionately. You didn't just respect Jack Churchill, you admired him, like a rare bird who somehow survived multiple migrations by dive-bombing predators and demanding they admire his feathers. He wasn't a reckless glory chaser. He was serious about discipline, leadership, and doing things well. He just happened to do them differently, and in a way that made you feel braver by association. He was also absurdly fit, even into his later years. Long after retiring, he could be found surfing, yes still, hiking across Scotland, or attending formal dinners where he may or may not have played the pipes halfway through dessert. He didn't slow down, he just adjusted his route. What made Jack so remarkable wasn't just the sword or the bagpipes or even the escape from a camp. It was the way he lived consistently, relentlessly, unapologetically as himself. While the world marched toward modernity, Jack kept one foot in history, one in chaos, and a third, metaphorical foot in whatever dimension inspires a man to commute by throwing things out of trains. He wasn't crazy, he simply refused to conform to the ordinary. He didn't seek attention, but attention clung to him like a confused barnacle asking, "Wait, are we doing this now?" Jack Churchill wasn't just the kind of man you told stories about. He was the story. When historians sit down to catalogue the great figures of World War II, they usually start with the usual suspects: Churchill, the Prime Minister, Roosevelt, Stalin, Eisenhower, but every now and then, somewhere deep in the footnotes or muttered among military nerds at obscure museums, the name Jack Churchill resurfaces, and the conversation always goes something like this. Wait, the guy with the sword? Yes, and the bow, and the bagpipes. That guy was real? Oh yes, very real. And his legacy? Unforgettable, even if it's often left out of the PowerPoint slides. Jack Churchill wasn't just a war hero, he was a walking contradiction. A man of the 20th century who lived like it was the 14th. A disciplined soldier with the heart of a showman, and a combat leader whose greatest weapon may have been the ability to make his enemies say, "Is that bagpipes?" before being overwhelmed by sheer confusion and occasionally a sword. To this day, he remains the last known soldier to have made a confirmed kill with a longbow in modern warfare. That's not a metaphor. It's not poetic license. He literally pulled an arrow from a quiver, drew back a wooden bow, and shot a man in the middle of a 20th century firefight. Somewhere between tanks, grenades, and machine guns, Jack Churchill took a sharp left turn into medieval history and scored a hit. It's a feat so unbelievable that many military historians still squint at the records like, surely that's a typo, but nope, it's right there, filed among logistics reports and casualty statistics. One German soldier dispatched by a man who looked like he wandered out of a Robin Hood reboot and never got the memo that time moved on. But Jack wasn't just a novelty act. He was a serious, competent, and highly respected officer. His peers admired him not just because he was flamboyant, but because he was effective. The sword and bagpipes weren't gimmicks, they were part of his strategy. Psychological warfare through pageantry. He didn't just fight battles, he owned them, made them theatrical, and then won them with flair. And while he never chased fame, Jack was famously modest about his exploits. His legend quietly influenced a generation of military eccentrics who came after him. You can draw a line from Jack's antics to those quirky, rules-bending mavericks in future wars, the ones who didn't quite follow protocol, but somehow got results. The guy in Vietnam who wore a cowboy hat in combat. The Gulf War officer who blasted Wagner from a Humvee. The colonel in Afghanistan who gave tactical briefings in rhyming couplets. None of them were quite Jack Churchill, but all of them owed something to his legacy. Still, his name rarely shows up in standard textbooks, and that's strange, because here's a man who played bagpipes during assaults, carried a broadsword into firefights, escaped from a concentration camp twice, saved 700 civilians with nothing but explosives and audacity, surfed into retirement like war was just one long vacation that got a little loud. If any of that had happened in a movie, people would roll their eyes. Too unrealistic, they'd say. No one would do that. But Jack did, and he did it without ever asking for the spotlight. Maybe that's why his story stayed buried for so long, because Jack never needed a parade. He had his pipes. Ask modern British soldiers, though, and you'll find he's still a cult hero, the kind of figure whispered about in training camps. You think you're tough? Jack Churchill once fought with a sword. He's the guy who reminds young recruits that war isn't just about tech and tactics. It's also about guts, grit, and the occasional medieval throwback. And let's be honest, historians still don't know how to categorize him. He doesn't fit the usual boxes. He wasn't your typical war hero. He wasn't a military theorist. He didn't write memoirs or run for office. He didn't seek glory. He just showed up in full Highland getup and acted like the Geneva Convention had an asterisk that said, unless it's hilarious. So how do you sum up Jack Churchill's legacy? You probably don't. You just tell people this: there was once a soldier who went to war with a sword, played the bagpipes under fire, shot a man with a longbow in 1940, escaped from a camp on foot, and lived to surf into old age. And then you add, no, seriously, look it up. Jack Churchill's legend doesn't need embellishment. It just needs telling. He was brave, he was dangerous, and he was deeply committed to cosplay that somehow, against all logic, worked. Most war stories end the same way. Medals, memorials, maybe a statue somewhere if the budget allows. But Jack Churchill's story doesn't feel like it ends. It lingers. It echoes. The way bagpipes do. Loud, unignorable, and just a little confusing. You don't forget a man who fought machine guns with a claymore. You don't overlook the guy who charged enemy lines like he was auditioning for a Shakespearean tragedy, and somehow won. And you definitely don't ignore the fact that in a world of bullets and bombs, Jack Churchill chose audacity as his deadliest weapon. There's a temptation to reduce Mad Jack to a gimmick. Oh yeah, the guy who brought a sword to World War II, haha, what a loon. But that misses the point entirely. He wasn't a joke, he wasn't some eccentric mascot, he was a trained officer, a highly decorated soldier, and a man with an unshakable philosophy. If you're going to fight, fight with everything you've got, including your identity. Jack's way of waging war was theatrical, yes, but it was also tactical. His flair wasn't just for kicks. It was a calculated shock to the system. Picture it, a battlefield full of trench mud, grey uniforms and the cold, impersonal hum of artillery, and suddenly, here comes a kilted man charging through the fog with a sword raised, bagpipes blaring behind him like the soundtrack to an ancient curse. That's not a distraction, that's psychological warfare with tartan. His legacy isn't just about bravery, it's about permission. Permission to be different in the most rigid of environments. Military life is built on conformity, matching uniforms, drilled routines, synchronized movements. Jack respected that discipline. He followed orders, but he never surrendered his personality. He didn't conform so tightly that he vanished. Instead, he painted a target on his back with bagpipes and said, "Come and get me." And that's what makes him timeless. 'Cause even if you're not on a battlefield, the world will still try to smother your weirdness. It will hand you a template and ask you to stay inside the lines. Jack Churchill didn't just ignore the lines. He charged through them while playing a Scottish reel and yelling something probably terrifying in Gaelic. There's a lesson here. No, not carry a sword everywhere, unless you really want some odd conversations with airport security, but rather be unshakably yourself, especially when everyone else is trying not to be. Jack didn't fight like everyone else, and that's why history remembers him. While other soldiers packed rations and ammo, Jack packed a bow, a sword, and what can only be described as vibes so strong they could win skirmishes on their own. And courage. Jack redefined it. We think of courage as standing up in the face of danger, but Jack made it into an art form. He turned danger into a dance partner. When most people hear gunfire and duck, Jack stood up and played music. When others planned slow retreats, he charged with no gun. It wasn't just about fighting, it was about refusing to be afraid on the enemy's terms. Even in peace, he didn't stop being Jack. He didn't become some sanitized version of his past. He surfed, he wandered, he threw briefcases off trains, he lived with the same conviction he fought with. Life is absurd, so why not meet it with a broadsword and a grin? And perhaps that's the deepest lesson of all, dignity through absurdity. He didn't mock war, but he didn't let it dehumanize him either. He stared into the ugliest parts of history, and refused to lose the parts of himself that made him human. His humor, his music, his individuality. In an age of uniformity, Jack Churchill was a walking anachronism, and somehow that made him exactly what the world needed. A reminder that in times of darkness, a little madness isn't just tolerable, it's necessary. It shakes the dust off our souls. It wakes people up. It tells them, you don't have to be like everyone else. You just have to be you, fully, fiercely, and with conviction. And so, as we close the story of the last man to kill with a longbow in modern warfare, of the sword-swinging, pipe-playing, briefcase-throwing legend, remember this: audacity is underrated, weirdness is power, and somewhere out there, a faint echo of bagpipes reminds us that one man once stood against the tides of history, not with a machine gun, but with courage and a claymore. Let's get one thing straight right away. Michelangelo Merisi da Caravaggio is not the same Michelangelo who painted the Sistine Chapel. That was Michelangelo Buonarroti, the Renaissance overachiever who made marble cry. Caravaggio was the other Michelangelo, the one who painted saints so lifelike they looked like they might ask you for spare change, the one who brought drama to art, and also to literally every social gathering he ever attended. Think of him as the Baroque era's answer to what if Quentin Tarantino painted religious scenes. Caravaggio was born in 1571 in the small northern Italian town of Caravaggio, which, spoiler alert, is where he got his name. His birth name was Michelangelo Merisi, but Caravaggio had a nice ring to it, like a guy who might show up at your door with a bottle of wine, a dagger, and a very emotional depiction of St. Matthew. He was born into a pretty well-off family by local standards. His father was a household architect and decorator for the local nobility. So yes, little Michelangelo was technically middle class, but this was 16th century Lombardy where the middle class still had to worry about being wiped out by disease, famine, or a particularly cranky bishop. And wouldn't you know it, the plague decided to make a guest appearance in his life early on. When Caravaggio was just 6 years old, the bubonic plague swept through the area and did what plagues do best: ruin everything. It killed off most of his family, including his father and grandfather, within the same week. Welcome to the late Renaissance, kid. Life expectancy was basically just a dare. Now imagine this young boy, already carrying the emotional baggage of a Shakespearean tragedy before he could spell his last name, growing up in a town still trying to shake off the stench of death, both literal and metaphorical. This was a time when hygiene was more of a philosophical debate than a daily habit. People used perfumes to cover body odor like it was an Olympic sport. Soap existed, but mostly in theory, and bathing was often seen as suspicious behavior. Nothing builds character like growing up in a plague zone with no concept of deodorant. After his childhood turned into an epidemiological horror story, Caravaggio moved to Milan, one of the major cultural and artistic centers of northern Italy. Milan in the late 16th century was a bustling hub of commerce, religion, and passive-aggressive art patrons, and it was here that Caravaggio began his artistic training under Simone Pitazano, a relatively minor Mannerist painter, but one who happened to claim he was a student of Titian, the Venetian master. In modern terms, that's like learning guitar from a guy who swears he once met Jimmy Page at a bar. While Pitazano's own style was nothing to write a dramatic gospel about, the experience gave Caravaggio access to artistic tools, techniques, and influences he wouldn't have found back in his plague-ridden hometown. He learned about composition, color theory, anatomy, and how to make your biblical scene just dramatic enough to impress a patron, but not dramatic enough to get you excommunicated. But even as a student, Caravaggio didn't quite fit in. He was impatient, intense, and deeply allergic to authority. He didn't want to paint dainty cherubs in puffy clouds. He wanted to paint real people, the kind with dirty feet, missing teeth, and the emotional range of a soap opera cast. It's as if he looked at religious painting and said, "This needs more realism, more shadows, and maybe a guy holding his own severed head." By the time he finished his apprenticeship in the early 1590s, Caravaggio was already developing a style that defied artistic conventions. He wasn't interested in ideal beauty or polished perfection. He wanted drama. He wanted realism. He wanted mess. His saints would look like ex-cons. His Madonnas would look like single moms, and his angels might be holding a knife instead of a harp. Armed with ambition and a suspicious lack of impulse control, Caravaggio packed his brushes and headed to Rome, a city that, at the time, was the spiritual and artistic Las Vegas of Europe. You went there to make a name for yourself, to find rich patrons, and if you were Caravaggio, to start an impressive collection of arrest warrants. Rome was bursting with opportunity and corruption in equal measure. The Catholic Church, facing the aftershocks of the Protestant Reformation, was in full counter-Reformation mode, meaning it needed powerful, emotionally gripping religious art to get butts back in pews. And Caravaggio, with his knack for turning biblical trauma into visual opera, was about to become their unexpected, unholy MVP. But he wasn't there yet. First he'd paint fruit, lots of fruit, grapes, pears, apples, so shiny they looked like they'd been waxed by angels. It was humble work, but even his still lifes had something unsettling, something too real. The grapes looked like they might rot if you stared too long, and lurking behind those still lifes was a man just itching to throw a punch. Because while Caravaggio may have painted quietly at first, his reputation for personal chaos was already brewing. The brushes were calm, the man, not so much. This was just the beginning. The angels, the outlaws, the jewels, the dramatic lighting, all of that would come later. But even now, Caravaggio was a man born not just to paint, but to make a scene, and history was watching. When Michelangelo Merisi da Caravaggio rolled into Rome in the early 1590s, he wasn't famous. He wasn't rich. He wasn't even moderately employed. What he was, however, was determined, stubborn, and already radiating the energy of a guy who could win a fistfight and a painting competition in the same hour. Picture him arriving in the eternal city with little more than his paintbrushes, an attitude problem, and the smouldering intensity of a man who deeply resented still life assignments. Now, Rome at this time was chaos with marble columns. It was the epicenter of Catholic power, teeming with cardinals, conmen, crusaders, and creatives like a Renaissance Coachella, but with more incense and fewer music festivals. Artists flocked here like moths to a very gilded flame, hoping to catch the eye of a rich patron who might feed them, clothe them, and occasionally let them paint something besides fruit in a bowl. And that's exactly where Caravaggio started. Still lifes, specifically very detailed, emotionally complex bowls of fruit. He worked briefly in the studio of Giuseppe Cesari, also known as Cavaliere d'Arpino, a highly respected painter who had all the prestige and none of the emotional instability Caravaggio was bringing to the table. Caravaggio's job: paint fruit and flowers, over and over, apples, grapes, peaches with just the right amount of bruising. His boy with a basket of fruit is practically vibrating with frustration. The boy looks like he's holding that basket because he's being punished. And yet, even in this early stage, Caravaggio's style was different. His still lifes weren't gentle and decorative. They were confrontational. His apples looked like they were judging you. His grapes looked like they had a backstory. The lighting was intense. The shadows were dramatic, and everything in the painting seemed vaguely offended to be there. Caravaggio painted still lifes like they owed him money. Eventually the tedium of pears became unbearable, and Caravaggio struck out on his own. This meant leaving the relative safety of Arpino's studio and stepping into the very competitive, often corrupt freelance art world of Rome. And here's where things get interesting, because Caravaggio, despite his lack of social graces, had one thing going for him: he was ridiculously good. His early independent works like The Fortune Teller and The Card Sharps caught the attention of art patrons who wanted something edgier, grittier, and less like it belonged in Grandma's chapel. These paintings didn't just depict people, they told stories, and not the polite, sanitized kind. Caravaggio was painting pickpockets, cheaters, and shifty glances across candlelit tables. It was real, it was human, and it was completely unlike anything else in the Roman art scene at the time. Enter Cardinal Francesco Maria del Monte. art lover, music patron, powerful church figure, and crucially, not afraid of a little scandal. Del Monte saw one of Caravaggio's paintings and said something along the lines of, "Yes, I'll take the one that looks like someone's about to get stabbed over a dice game." Del Monte became Caravaggio's first major patron, and arguably the reason we even know who Caravaggio is today. He brought the scrappy painter into his household, provided him with food, lodging, and most importantly, connections. Suddenly, Caravaggio was painting for cardinals, noblemen, and wealthy families who wanted religious works that could make a sinner cry, and a bishop question his job security. Del Monte didn't just give Caravaggio a paycheck, he gave him a stage. He introduced him to people who mattered, scholars, collectors, theologians, and the kind of art critics who wore lace collars and judged everything except their own fashion choices. And Caravaggio delivered. He painted scenes so emotionally raw they practically sweated guilt. His penitent Magdalene wasn't a glossy icon of beauty, it was a real woman, exhausted and tear-streaked, sitting in remorse like she just got off a shift at a tavern. His Saint Catherine of Alexandria looked like she might actually throw hands with her torturers. The drama wasn't just in the subject matter, it was in the light, the composition, the fact that everyone looked like they'd had a day. But even as his star rose, Caravaggio never quite fit into Rome's polished elite. He dressed like he was perpetually late to a duel, refused to flatter his subjects, and had the unnerving habit of treating biblical commissions like personal therapy sessions. His paintings weren't meant to comfort, they were meant to punch you in the soul. It didn't take long for rumors to start swirling, that he was arrogant, that he was dangerous, that he might actually be cursed. And sure, most of those things were true, but he was also the most talked about artist in Rome, and in the age before Twitter, that was really saying something. So here he was, a man with dirt on his shoes, shadows in his paint, and a rapidly growing list of enemies who couldn't quite decide if they wanted to beat him up or buy his next masterpiece. Rome, as it turned out, didn't know what hit it, but Caravaggio was just getting warmed up. Before Caravaggio picked up a brush, religious art was having a bit of a golden age identity crisis. The Renaissance had given us luminous Madonnas, muscular martyrs, and saints who looked suspiciously like part-time underwear models. Everything was glowing, graceful, and deeply flattering to the idea of divine perfection. It was God's official Instagram filter, and artists like Raphael and Perugino had mastered the art of painting spiritual serenity with a soft focus lens. Then Caravaggio showed up with a bucket of black paint, a deep suspicion of beauty standards, and what can only be described as aggressive lighting issues. Enter tenebrism, Caravaggio's signature style of using intense contrasts between light and dark, not to gently illuminate, but to dramatically drag characters out of the void like a spotlight at a police lineup. Unlike the softer chiaroscuro used by earlier artists to give figures gentle modeling, tenebrism was about sharp theatrical darkness. Shadows didn't just exist, they lurked, and light didn't caress, it interrogated. In Caravaggio's world, light wasn't holy, it was harsh, suspicious, and probably asking tough questions. Take The Calling of St. Matthew, one of his most famous pieces. There's a dusty tavern scene, a group of men hunched over coins like they're about to be audited, and then bam, a sudden burst of light slicing through the room, pointing at a stunned tax collector. Jesus is barely lit, almost just a silhouette, as he coolly gestures at Matthew like he's picking someone for dodgeball. There are no halos, no heavenly clouds, just divine intervention via side-eye and a beam of light that looks like it's kicking down the door. Audiences were shocked, not because they didn't recognize the story, most churchgoers knew their Bible inside and out, but because they didn't expect to see it played out like a gritty backroom poker deal. Saints weren't supposed to look like this. Dirty toenails, wrinkled robes, sunburned foreheads. It was like seeing your Uber driver cast as Saint Peter, and yet that was the point. Caravaggio refused to idealize. He painted what he saw around him: beggars, bruises, fish guts, greasy fingernails. His Saint Peter didn't look like a radiant founder of the church. He looked like a tired fisherman who had very recently lost an argument with a net. His Madonna wasn't a glowing celestial queen. She was a weary mother who probably had opinions about how little sleep she was getting. He painted saints like they'd just come off a night shift at the fish market. To say this was controversial would be putting it mildly. Church patrons were torn. Some were thrilled, finally. Art that made religion feel real, raw, and immediate. Others were scandalized, clutching their rosaries as if Caravaggio had personally kicked an angel. A few commissions were even rejected. Too indecent, too human, too disturbingly relatable. And yet the drama of his paintings worked. Spectators didn't just view Caravaggio's work, they felt it. His conversion of St. Paul puts you practically under the hooves of a collapsing horse. His crucifixion of St. Peter makes you feel the straining ropes, the gritty dust, the awful gravity of the scene. You're not an observer, you're an accomplice. This was religious art that didn't aim to elevate your soul so much as shake it awake. It didn't float above the viewer, it lunged off the canvas. It's no surprise that his work became catnip for the Counter-Reformation Church, which needed intense, emotionally manipulative art to win hearts and tithes back from the Protestants. And while most artists responded to this call by simply painting more cherubs and extra gold leaf, Caravaggio went full biblical noir. His works were like visual sermons delivered by a preacher who'd seen some stuff. Critically, his models were real people. Caravaggio didn't hire ethereal studio professionals. He used the people he knew. Street vendors, courtesans, criminals. The man didn't so much cast his paintings as round up a local improv group with a rap sheet. The result? Faces with character. Wrinkles, stubble, swollen eyes, expressions so sincere you could swear they were whispering their regrets off canvas. Of course, this approach came with risks. Rumors swirled that one of his Madonnas was modeled on a known prostitute. Scandalous? Yes. Effective? Also yes. Caravaggio wasn't trying to make his subjects into saints. He was showing you that maybe the saints were just like us. Flawed, tired, sore, real. If earlier artists painted the divine in human form, Caravaggio painted the divine as human experience. His Jesus didn't glow, he bled. His saints didn't float, they fell. And the heavens didn't open with golden rays, they cracked open like a storm cloud with one very focused beam of interrogation light. His work redefined religious painting, dragging it, sometimes literally, out of the clouds and down into the dirt, the sweat, the blood. It was shocking, it was powerful, and it was absolutely intentional. Caravaggio wasn't painting holiness, he was painting the struggle toward it, and in doing so, he lit up the art world, not with halos, but with hard truth and dramatic shadows. In the polished halls of Renaissance and Baroque art, where noblemen posed stiffly and saints floated through soft clouds of virtue, Caravaggio took one look around and said, "You know what this needs? More sex workers and knife fights." While other painters scouted for muses in churches or noble courts, Caravaggio cast his paintings like a 16th century Guy Ritchie film. He didn't want aristocrats or ethereal figures. He wanted faces with stories, faces that looked like they'd lived through something and might be willing to talk about it for the price of a drink and some crusty bread. Let's start with one of his favorites, Philaide Melandroni. Officially, she was a Roman courtesan. Unofficially, she was a legend. Philaide wasn't just beautiful. She was sharp, confident, and carried herself like she owned whatever poorly lit tavern she walked into. Caravaggio used her repeatedly in his paintings. She posed as Judith, calmly slicing off the head of Holofernes, and as Saint Catherine, resting on the spiked wheel of her upcoming martyrdom like she was posing for a fashion editorial titled "Spiritual but Make It Edgy." Art historians have spent decades arguing about Caravaggio's relationship with Philaide. Was she his lover, his muse, his artistic partner in crime? Or just someone with the best deadpan glare in Rome? We may never know, but what's certain is this: he didn't pick her by accident. When Caravaggio wanted to show women with strength, complexity, and the ability to stare straight through a man's soul, he called Philaide. Other recurring characters in Caravaggio's cast included Mario Minetti, a fellow painter and all-around ride-or-die companion. Mario shows up in everything from the musicians to the taking of Christ, always with that same "I didn't sign up for this but now I'm here" energy. He had the face of a sweet, long-suffering choir boy, which Caravaggio used both sincerely and ironically, depending on whether he needed an angel, a martyr, or a really expressive background character. Then there's the wonderful oddity of Bacchus, god of wine as imagined by Caravaggio. He's not the regal, muscular party deity you might expect. Instead, he's a vaguely hungover teenage boy with wine-stained lips, questionable hygiene, and a look that says, "I don't know how I got here, but I blame the grapes." Scholars believe Caravaggio may have used himself as the model for this one, which makes sense. Who else could capture that exact blend of charm and chaos? The magic and the controversy lay in how undeniably real these people were. Viewers didn't just see a saint or a sinner. They saw someone they might have passed on the street that morning. And in Rome, that someone might have been shouting slurred insults at a priest while holding a half-eaten fig. Imagine commissioning a portrait of Jesus and Caravaggio sends you Paolo the neighborhood drunk. That actually wasn't far off from what happened. Caravaggio's religious commissions often included models who were well known in the Roman underclass. Prostitutes became Madonnas, beggars became apostles. One cardinal reportedly recognized a working girl from a local brothel, posing as the Virgin Mary in a church altarpiece, and wrote a letter to the Pope so fast he probably sprained his wrist. This wasn't just edgy casting, it was a statement. Caravaggio believed that sacred stories belonged to everyone, especially the people who had been pushed to the margins. He wasn't mocking religion, he was humanizing it. His Jesus was poor, his saints were exhausted, his martyrs were ordinary people trying to hold on to their faith while bleeding on the floor. Of course, not everyone appreciated the honesty. Critics accused him of blasphemy. Priests demanded revisions. One biographer described him as a man whose paintings were as vulgar as his temper. But Caravaggio didn't care. He wasn't aiming for divine approval. He was aiming for truth with teeth. And he got it. These weren't just models. They were people who brought their own stories, scars and struggles into the frame. Every crease in a forehead, every grimy fingernail, every tear that may or may not have been genuine, they all added to the intensity of the scene. His characters didn't just look like they were in pain, you believed they were. It's worth noting that Caravaggio often painted these same people over and over, not because he lacked imagination, but because he trusted them. They gave him authenticity, and he gave them a kind of immortality. Whether it was Judith mid-execution or John the Baptist, looking like he hadn't showered in a week, they were all undeniably wonderfully human. And maybe that was the scandal. Not the prostitutes, not the beggars, but the fact that Caravaggio dared to suggest that holiness could wear wrinkled robes and street dust. That sacred beauty didn't have to be polished. It could be tired, angry, real. In a time when artists aimed to smooth out the rough edges of humanity, Caravaggio went digging for them. He found his saints not in palaces, but in alleyways, and in doing so he forever changed what sacred art could be. Caravaggio was a master of contrasts, not just on canvas, but in life. One minute, he was painting saints with tear-streaked eyes and divine light kissing their brows. The next, he was smashing a wine jug over someone's head because they looked at him wrong. By the early 1600s, Caravaggio had firmly secured his place in Rome's art world, not just as a genius with a paintbrush, but as a walking tavern brawl in breeches. His masterpieces were hanging in churches. His name was being whispered in noble salons, and his rap sheet was starting to look like it needed footnotes. While most Renaissance painters worried about staying in their patron's good graces, Caravaggio seemed more focused on winning the most likely to be arrested for vandalizing a waiter award. His reputation for violence was not just a rumor, it was an ongoing saga, carefully documented in Rome's criminal archives like a particularly spicy reality show. You see, Rome in Caravaggio's time had no shortage of lawbreakers, but he brought a certain artistic flair to his misbehavior. He wasn't content with mere drunken shouting or public urination. He escalated quickly and with gusto. He fought with waiters over whether artichokes were fried in butter or oil. Yes, that's a real charge. Attacked rivals with swords, and was once accused of throwing a plate of artichokes in someone's face and then stabbing them. Somewhere, a modern food critic just felt spiritually seen. His arrest records read less like a formal indictment, and more like a very aggressive travel itinerary. 15098. Arrested for carrying an unlicensed sword, because apparently, even chaotic geniuses need permits. 1600. Sued for insulting a painter. He allegedly walked into the man's studio just to yell, "Your paintings are garbage," and left. 1601. Questioned in a case involving a dead man in a ditch. Not convicted, but that's not ideal. 1604. Arrested again for beating a notary with a stick after a heated argument, possibly about a woman or a missed dinner invitation. 1605. Accused of hurling stones at the police while shirtless and shouting, "Do you know who I am?" Answer, yes, unfortunately. Caravaggio didn't do self-portraits, probably because mirrors reminded him of police lineups, and yet somehow, amid this storm of duels, legal complaints and general public menace, Caravaggio continued to produce some of the most emotionally resonant art in Western history. One day he'd be in a bar fight, the next he'd deliver The Entombment of Christ, a painting so profoundly human that it still makes viewers cry 400 years later. It's like if Van Gogh had a switchblade and a bench warrant, but also dropped museum-quality canvases between brawls. This wasn't just a man with a temper, it was a lifestyle. Caravaggio didn't separate the art from the artist. He smashed them together like flint and steel, and then painted the sparks. His life was a perpetual collision between genius and chaos, and somehow he kept walking away with both broken noses and commissions. Friends? He had a few, though most probably kept one eye on the nearest exit. Enemies? Oh, plenty. Other artists loathed him for his arrogance. Critics scorned him for his lack of classical refinement, and Rome's authorities viewed him as a particularly artsy brand of menace to society. But Caravaggio didn't just fight to fight. He fought because he could not back down. In a world obsessed with hierarchy and decorum, he was a living, breathing middle finger to authority. If a man slighted him in the street, he wouldn't settle for a stern glare. He'd go home, paint that man as a cowardly Goliath, and then show up at his doorstep the next day with a sword and a grudge. There's even speculation that Caravaggio sought out violence as a kind of artistic fuel. Some biographers argue that his intensity in painting, those agonized faces, that raw vulnerability, came not in spite of his aggression but because of it. Every punch he threw, every insult he hurled, added kindling to the emotional bonfire he lit on canvas. It's also worth noting that Caravaggio lived in a time when honor culture ruled the streets. Offend someone, and you didn't just exchange heated words, you dueled, or threatened to duel, or hired someone else to duel. Rome was a pressure cooker of fragile egos, religious fervor and lots of sharp, pointy things. And Caravaggio, with his hair-trigger temper and total disregard for consequences, was made for it. The great irony is that even as his behavior became more erratic, his art became more transcendent. It's as if he channeled all the chaos, bitterness and fury into paint. His saints weep harder, his light burns deeper, his sinners tremble with real fear. No artist before had made the spiritual so terrifyingly close, and maybe that's because Caravaggio lived on the edge of judgment. Of course, this kind of lifestyle wasn't sustainable. Fists and swords catch up with you eventually, and soon one particularly deadly encounter would change everything. But that's for another chapter. For now, picture him in a tavern, bruised but grinning, surrounded by empty wine jugs and half-completed sketches. The man who could knock out your teeth and deliver a masterpiece, sometimes on the same day. 1606, a year that started with a little recreational tennis and ended with Caravaggio wanted for murder. Now let's be clear, this wasn't tennis as we know it today. There were no neon headbands, polite claps or courtside strawberries. This was palla corda, a brutal Renaissance ancestor of tennis, played with wooden rackets, zero chill, and the sort of emotional regulation you'd expect from men in tights carrying swords. On May 28th, Caravaggio met a man named Ranuccio Tomasoni on the court. It was supposed to be a match. It turned into a homicide. And not just a spur-of-the-moment oopsie either. This was a full-on death-by-tennis situation. So who was Ranuccio? Depending on who you ask, he was either a low-ranking nobleman, a local thug, a rival pimp, or just the unlucky guy who stood between Caravaggio and a very bad Tuesday. He and Caravaggio had butted heads before over gambling debts, women, or bruised egos. Maybe all three. The two were known to move in the same circles, which in Caravaggio's case usually meant angry, sweaty men with grudges and short swords. Details of the event are murky, but most historians agree that the match escalated quickly. 1 minute, arguing over points, the next drawing swords. It's not every day someone says advantage Caravaggio and means it literally. The fight spilled into the street. Words became blows, blows became blades, and when the dust settled, Ranuccio Tomasoni lay bleeding out, stabbed through the groin. A wound so specifically horrifying that historians have long suspected this wasn't just a fight over tennis. It was personal. Some theories claim it was about a woman. Some say it was a revenge killing in disguise. Others believe Caravaggio simply couldn't stand losing a game. Honestly, all of those are plausible. Caravaggio had the temper of a firecracker in a cathedral, and the emotional depth of a man who painted saints weeping for breakfast. Either way, the result was the same: murder. Rome did not take kindly to casual bloodshed in broad daylight. Even if you were the city's most controversial celebrity painter, within days, Caravaggio was officially declared a fugitive, and a bando capitale was issued, a legal sentence that meant anyone anywhere could kill him on sight, and no one would be punished for it. It was like getting cancelled, medieval style with swords. Thus began Caravaggio's artist on the run arc, a period of history where he would flee from city to city like a Baroque Jason Bourne, desperately painting altarpieces while avoiding bounty hunters. He left Rome behind with a sword in his belt, a price on his head, and probably some unpaid tavern tabs. Friends, lovers, and patrons were left scrambling to either help him hide or distance themselves from his increasingly radioactive reputation. And all the while his paintings remained hanging in Rome's churches, a trail of masterpieces left by a man no one could legally invite to Sunday service anymore. It's worth pausing to appreciate how uniquely Caravaggio this incident was. Most painters might storm off in a huff after losing a match, maybe throw their racket, maybe insult someone's mother. Caravaggio stabs a man, destroys his career, and immediately becomes a national manhunt. The man didn't do anything halfway. Only Caravaggio could turn a casual game of tennis into a felony. And let's not forget, this was peak Counter-Reformation Rome. The church was trying to present itself as the bastion of moral order, which made the fact that one of their favorite artists was now a roaming, blood-stained outlaw awkward to say the least. Still, the murder didn't destroy his career, not entirely. Caravaggio was too valuable. His patrons whispered to cardinals. Bishops shrugged uncomfortably. Some church officials tried to pull strings to secure him a pardon, while others distanced themselves like he was contagious. Meanwhile, Caravaggio himself fled to Naples, a city with fewer moral scruples and a serious appetite for emotionally tormented paintings, and Naples welcomed him the way a nightclub welcomes a celebrity with an ankle monitor, cautiously, but with open arms. It's a strange paradox. The more unhinged Caravaggio became, the more powerful his art grew. Maybe it was the desperation, maybe the guilt, maybe the fact that having a bounty on your head adds a certain urgency to your brushstrokes. But whatever it was, his post-murder work took on a darker, deeper, more haunting tone. Every canvas was a confession. Every figure looked like they had something to hide, and maybe they did. After turning a casual game of tennis into a murder investigation and earning a death sentence in Rome, most people would lay low, maybe flee to a quiet village, learn to knit, adopt a new identity and pretend to enjoy soup. But not Caravaggio. Caravaggio's idea of laying low involved fleeing to Naples, painting dramatic altarpieces, getting into more fights, and then deciding against all common sense that the best place for a man with a rap sheet longer than a papal sermon was a strict religious military order, and thus began the Malta phase. Now, the Knights of Malta, or more formally, the Sovereign Military Order of St. John of Jerusalem, were no joke. These were elite celibate warrior monks who fought in the Crusades and took vows of piety, discipline, and no stabbing each other at dinner. They ran a fortified island, lived by a code of honor, and basically acted like medieval Jedi in matching outfits. Naturally, Caravaggio thought, sounds like my people. In 1607 he arrived in Malta hoping to clean up his reputation, curry favor with powerful allies, and maybe even score a papal pardon for that tiny homicide incident. He also had a game plan: impress the Grand Master with his brush, not his blade. Surprisingly, it worked at first. Caravaggio painted a massive dramatic portrait of Grand Master Alof de Wignacourt, decked out in armor, cape, and full "don't mess with me" energy. The painting was a hit. Suddenly, the fugitive from Rome was being treated like a prodigal son of Christendom. In a shocking move, the order even made him a knight. Yes, Caravaggio became Fra Michelangelo Merisi, Knight of Grace. It was his best shot at redemption, a fresh start, a new chapter, and it lasted about 5 minutes, because Caravaggio, true to form, could not stop being Caravaggio. Within months of receiving his shiny new knighthood, he assaulted another knight, likely over an insult, or a tavern squabble, or just the fact that someone breathed too loudly near his bread. The records are vague, but what we do know is that the other knight was a high-ranking noble. The fight was vicious, and Caravaggio landed himself in a Maltese prison so secure it was built into the side of a cliff. But prison didn't hold him for long, because Caravaggio escaped. How? No one knows exactly. Some say he bribed guards. Others believe he scaled the wall using ropes, rage, and maybe some divine assistance. Whatever the method, he slipped out of the fortress and fled Malta under cover of night, leaving behind only rumors and one very confused Grand Master. This, as you might imagine, did not sit well with the Knights of Malta. They responded with what can only be described as a divine-level breakup. On December 1, 1608, the order held a public ceremony where they officially expelled Caravaggio, stripping him of his title and declaring him a foul and rotten member unworthy of the order. Basically, they unknighted him in the most dramatic way possible. It was like being spiritually fired by a group of monks, complete with torches, robes, and a formal declaration that he was in effect dead to them. He joined a sacred order of knights, then committed crimes so fast they basically unbaptized him. You'd think that kind of celestial humiliation would slow him down. It didn't. Caravaggio made a beeline back to Naples, where, shockingly, he was still in demand. Wealthy patrons, many of whom had never not been in legal trouble themselves, welcomed him back like a prodigal puncher. He painted furiously. Some of his most powerful and haunted works come from this period, like the Martyrdom of St. Ursula, which radiates the kind of inner turmoil you'd expect from a man banned from both polite society and religious knighthood. His brushstrokes grew darker, his saints more desperate, his figures more isolated. It's as if he was painting the walls of his own collapsing psyche. And just to add one final dose of chaos, someone in Naples attacked him badly. We don't know exactly who or why, but Caravaggio was reportedly jumped by several men, disfigured and left for dead. Some believe it was revenge from the night he assaulted in Malta. Others think it was a jealous rival, or maybe someone tired of getting insulted at dinner. Whatever the reason, Caravaggio survived, but barely. He was scarred, paranoid, and desperate. A genius in decline, haunted by the ghosts he'd painted and the lives he'd wrecked, his own included. He would spend the final years of his life on the run, always painting, always moving, always hoping for a pardon that never quite came in time. But that's for another chapter. By the late 1600s, Caravaggio was a man with two unstoppable streaks, a creative renaissance and a criminal meltdown. His name whispered through art circles like legend. while his wanted poster probably hung in every police station from Rome to Sicily. He wasn't just famous, he was infamous, a man whose reputation gleamed in the galleries and smoldered in the dungeons. Most painters worry about deadlines. Caravaggio worried about extradition, and yet, despite being an outlaw, a fugitive, and quite possibly the only artist who had to check for bounty hunters between brushstrokes, he kept producing masterpieces. Not just decent works, earth-shattering, emotionally devastating, visually explosive works that rewrote the rules of religious art. Let's start with the beheading of St. John the Baptist, painted in 1608 in Malta. Yes, that Malta, the one that eventually threw him out like a cursed wine jug. This massive canvas wasn't just a painting, it was an earthquake in oil. The composition is spare but chilling. A dark prison courtyard, the saint collapsed, the sword mid-motion, and blood pooling across the stone like spilled ink. There's no divine light, no angelic comfort, just grim silence, shadow, and the quiet horror of justice gone barbaric. What really makes the painting twist the knife? Caravaggio signs his name in St. John's blood. Subtle? No. Effective? Absolutely. Then there's David with the head of Goliath. A familiar biblical scene, boy kills giant. But Caravaggio twists it into psychological theatre. David stands holding Goliath's severed head, but look closer and you'll realize Goliath's face is Caravaggio's own. That's right, he painted himself as the decapitated villain. It's not a victory image. David's face is mournful, even haunted. It's more pity than triumph. The message? Caravaggio wasn't celebrating violence, he was confessing. Through David, he was confronting the monster he'd become. It's a deeply unsettling moment. Most painters sign their work in the corner. Caravaggio signed his with existential guilt and his own decapitated head. And these weren't one-offs. Throughout his time on the run, his paintings became darker, lonelier, more inward. His Madonnas were tired. His saints looked like survivors of emotional collapse. Every canvas seemed to whisper, "Forgive me," even when the scene was supposed to be triumphant. What makes this period fascinating isn't just the art, it's how much of it happened while Caravaggio was basically a fugitive with a paintbrush. You'd think having a legal bounty on your head would dry up work opportunities. Not for Caravaggio. Patrons kept hiring him, even as he dodged papal justice like a Baroque-era Jason Bourne. Wealthy collectors, nobles and bishops were all too happy to slide a commission under the metaphorical prison door. It was like hiring a hitman who also painted saints. We need a crucifixion. And also, do you have a guy who can sneak past border guards? It was an open secret. Caravaggio was dangerous, possibly unstable, definitely hard to manage, but the man could paint souls, and that made everything else negotiable. In Naples, his works were being snapped up faster than he could finish them. Local nobility overlooked the scars, the rumors, the failed assassination attempts. They didn't care that his last job ended in a stabbing. They just wanted the raw power of his brush on their chapel walls. His portfolio could win awards. His criminal record could win a courtroom drama Emmy, but this strange double life couldn't last forever. His fame bought him shelter, yes, but it also drew eyes. Rivals plotted, old enemies whispered. At least one attempted attack left him so badly wounded that some claimed he'd been disfigured beyond recognition. Whether that's true or just artistic gossip is debatable, but it adds to the myth of a man haunted by the very drama he painted. What's so compelling and tragic about this phase of Caravaggio's life is how closely his art and his downfall were intertwined. Each new painting felt like a confession, each new scandal a stroke of doom. He wasn't just working through themes of light and darkness on canvas. He was living them, bleeding them, trying desperately to paint his way out of damnation. He wanted redemption, but couldn't stop stabbing himself metaphorically and occasionally, literally. His supporters kept hoping the next painting would win him a pardon. The next masterpiece would be the one that earned the Pope's forgiveness. The next canvas would be his salvation, but salvation is a tricky thing, especially when you keep offending everyone who can grant it. As his fame swelled, so did the tension. Caravaggio was now a man trapped in his own legend, chased by shadows and painting like every canvas might be his last. And soon it would be. If ever there was a man destined to be unalived under bizarre, chaotic, and questionably documented circumstances, it was Michelangelo Merisi da Caravaggio. And wouldn't you know it, he absolutely delivered. By 1610, Caravaggio was 38 years old, had produced some of the most influential art in Europe, and was still legally considered a walking felony with paintbrush privileges. He had spent the past 4 years on the run, hopping from Naples to Malta to Sicily and back again, leaving behind masterpieces, bruises, arrest warrants, and possibly several very confused innkeepers. But now he was tired, exhausted really. The outlaw glamour had worn thin, and the weight of his crimes, especially that one very fatal tennis match, hung heavy. So Caravaggio decided it was time to clear his name, to return to Rome, to beg for a papal pardon and finally re-enter polite society, or at least a city that didn't have his face on wanted posters. In the summer of 1610 he set out from Naples with a few paintings meant as gifts to Greece Vatican palms, some supplies, and presumably a face that still looked like it had recently argued with a brick wall. He never made it to Rome. Instead, he died suddenly in Porto Ercole, a quiet coastal town in Tuscany, under circumstances so murky they make his shadowy paintings look like crystal clear selfies. Was it malaria? A fever brought on by infection from a previous injury? Maybe. The marshes around the port were notoriously disease-ridden, and Caravaggio had reportedly been in bad health for months. Was it murder? Possibly. One theory says he was hunted down by the Knights of Malta as revenge for disgracing their order and stabbing one of their own, because apparently they had a long memory and a short temper. Was it poison? Another theory. Some claim he was poisoned by jealous rivals in Naples who wanted him out of the picture, both artistically and literally. Or was it just Caravaggio being Caravaggio, running from his past, trusting the wrong people, eating questionable seafood, and screaming at the sky until his organs gave out? We'll never know. His body was buried quickly. No pomp, no final portrait, no dramatic last words like, "Tell the Pope I repent," just a rushed interment in a mass grave somewhere near the coast. His final resting place, still unknown. His funeral, probably attended by 3 seagulls and a debt collector. But his legend? Oh, that didn't stay buried. Caravaggio died as he lived, chaotically, mysteriously, and probably yelling. Within weeks, rumors bloomed like fungus in a forgotten wine cellar. Some said he was seen alive days after the reported death. Others swore he was killed in a sword fight. A few claimed the Pope himself had ordered a hit, which is admittedly a very dramatic way to reject someone's pardon request. One writer insisted Caravaggio was found dead naked on the beach, clutching art supplies and babbling about divine light. Another claimed he died in a hospital, abandoned and muttering prayers. Every story had a different ending, but all of them agreed on one thing. It was weird, fast, and somehow very on-brand. And as the body vanished, the myth began. Artists and writers began painting him as a cursed genius, a martyr of passion, a man too raw and real for his time. His technique, once controversial, was now hailed as revolutionary. His enemies conveniently forgot they'd ever criticized him. His fans declared him a tragic prophet who saw too much, felt too deeply, and probably would have punched you for saying that out loud. Today, Caravaggio is one of the most studied, revered, and downright fascinating figures in art history. His paintings are in the Vatican, the Louvre, the Uffizi. His style, tenebrism, that delicious cocktail of divine light and soul-crushing darkness, became the blueprint for generations of painters. And his wildlife? Still the stuff of books, films, podcasts, and dinner party debates that start with, "Okay, but did he stab that guy on purpose?" His death may be a mystery, but his impact is unmistakable. Caravaggio wasn't just an artist. He was a comet, blazing, reckless, and completely uninterested in the rules of gravity. No quiet fade into obscurity. No final self-portrait of an old man in soft candlelight. Just one last chapter written in chaos. And honestly, what else would you expect from a man whose entire life was spent chasing light into darkness and dragging the rest of us along with him. Caravaggio didn't just leave behind a body of work, he left behind a cultural crater. The man might have died mysteriously, buried in an unmarked grave somewhere near a swamp, but his influence, that lives on in every art museum, film noir shot, and dramatic close-up of a guy holding a candle like he just saw his tax bill. His legacy isn't neat, it's not polite. It doesn't wear powdered wigs or smile from marble busts. It broods in corners, it bleeds, it stares you down across centuries and asks, are you really ready to see what humanity looks like? Let's start with his most immediate impact. He completely rewired how people thought about religious art. Before Caravaggio, saints looked like celestial Instagram models, serene, glowing, and suspiciously clean for people who were allegedly martyred in deserts. Then Caravaggio stormed in with dirty feet, scabby knees, and apostles who looked like they just got off a shift hauling fish. He ripped divine figures down from the clouds and threw them onto the streets of Rome. His Jesus had cracked fingernails. His Madonnas had bags under their eyes. Holiness didn't float, it hurt. That rawness shook the art world like someone had kicked over a marble statue and yelled, "Your God wears sandals." His contemporaries were both horrified and awestruck. Some called it blasphemy, others called it genius, but no one walked away from a Caravaggio painting thinking, that was fine. And it wasn't just about the content, it was the lighting. Enter tenebrism, a style that didn't just play with shadows, it weaponized them. Caravaggio's scenes looked like they were staged in back alleys with a single overhead lamp and a terrifying sense of urgency. Bright, divine light would slice through suffocating blackness, spotlighting trembling hands, dying eyes, and moments of revelation like they were about to drop the album of the year. Modern cinematography owes him big time. Think The Godfather, Schindler's List, Breaking Bad. Anytime you've watched a character give a dramatic monologue while half their face is swallowed in darkness, you're basically watching Caravaggio by way of HBO, and his artistic children, oh, they were legion. Rembrandt borrowed his contrast and psychological depth. Rubens admired his dramatic tension. Velázquez nodded to his realism. Even centuries later, artists from the Romantic period to postmodernism found themselves quoting Caravaggio's intensity, whether they meant to or not. Yet for a long time he was forgotten, or, more accurately, deliberately ignored. His life was too messy, his techniques too brutal, his attitude too felony-adjacent. For much of the 18th and 19th centuries, art historians quietly filed him under problematic genius and tried to focus on people who didn't threaten to duel their patrons over lunch. But by the 20th century, the tide shifted. Scholars rediscovered his work not just as technically brilliant, but philosophically radical. Caravaggio wasn't just painting religious stories. He was dissecting what it meant to be human. Flawed, scared, desperate, proud. Every canvas was a sermon with blood under its nails. Suddenly, he wasn't just a painter, he was a rock star of the Baroque, centuries ahead of his time. Exhibitions packed museums. Books, documentaries, and films tried to piece together his chaotic life. Artists name-dropped him like he was the edgy granddad who spiked the communion wine and still made it to heaven. And really, how could they resist? This was a man who painted angels with bruises, saints who looked like dock workers, and himself as Goliath, decapitated, defeated, and full of remorse. He wasn't trying to impress anyone, he was trying to confess. Today, Caravaggio is everywhere. His paintings hang in the world's most prestigious galleries, the Vatican, the Uffizi, the Louvre. Scholars still argue about his symbolism. Directors still study his compositions. His life, once buried in scandal and swamp fog, is now a saga taught in classrooms and whispered through audio guides in 8 languages. Today he's in museums. Back then he was on wanted posters. But perhaps his most lasting legacy isn't in brushstrokes or lighting techniques. It's in the message his art sends, over and over again. That divinity can be found in brokenness, that truth isn't always beautiful, and that sometimes the most powerful thing you can do is tell the story exactly as it is, mud, blood, shadows, and all. Caravaggio was flawed. violent, unstable, but also blazingly honest. And in a world full of filters and facades, that kind of honesty still punches through like a spotlight in the dark. He didn't just paint with light, he fought with it, and centuries later, he's still winning. There are people who are born into this world quietly, perhaps with a sleepy yawn, a subtle sneeze, and a soft blanket. And then there was Salvador Dali, who may as well have popped out of the womb in a velvet cape, holding a golden cane and announcing his arrival with interpretive jazz hands. Dali was born on May 11, 1904, in the sleepy town of Figueres, in northeastern Spain, a picturesque Catalonian village nestled between the Pyrenees and the Mediterranean, perfect for inspiring peaceful landscapes or hosting the early years of an artistic prodigy. Except Salvador Dali was never particularly interested in peaceful landscapes. From the beginning, he wasn't just living, he was performing life. And here's where things get properly surreal. Dali was told he was the reincarnation of his dead older brother. Yes, you read that correctly. 2 years before Salvador was born, his parents had another son, also named Salvador, who tragically died of gastroenteritis at the age of 22 months. And instead of processing this grief the traditional way, say journaling or therapy, his parents had a different strategy: tell their new child he was the spiritual continuation of the dead one. According to Dali, they even took him to visit the original Salvador's grave as a child and said, essentially, there you are, imagine being 6 years old and trying to process the idea that you've already lived one life, died, and are now back for round 2. No wonder the guy grew up melting clocks. It didn't stop there. From a young age, Dali wasn't just different, he demanded to be. As a boy, he wore extravagant clothes and carried himself like a time traveler who'd been stranded in a century 50 years behind or ahead of his own. His classmates wore wool trousers. Dali wore a cape. They brought lunch. Dali brought drama. By age 10, he was already painting with disturbing intensity. His early works weren't doodles of happy trees. They were eerily detailed landscapes and portraits with unsettling precision. Art teachers either adored him or avoided eye contact. His parents, perhaps recognizing they had birthed a tornado in human form, sent him to art school to try and direct all this energy somewhere productive. It only got weirder. At the School of Fine Arts in Madrid, Dali perfected the art of eccentricity with the same enthusiasm most students reserve for keg stands. He grew out his hair, cultivated a dramatic mustache, still in beta mode at this point, and declared that traditional logic was an oppressive force best painted over with rhinoceros horns and existential crisis. He wasn't just a student, he was a walking art installation. Dali's wardrobe included fur-lined coats, bright socks, and enough flamboyant scarves to mummify a giraffe. His roommates would later recall that his entire room looked like an art museum that had suffered a mild psychotic break. And while most students struggled to pass their exams, Dali pulled a uniquely Dali stunt. He got expelled for refusing to be examined. His logic? The professors were too intellectually inferior to judge his work, which, to be fair, is kind of like storming out of a cooking competition because the judges don't understand your soufflé made of sadness and anchovy dreams. Arrogant? Yes. On brand? Oh, absolutely. Dali would later reflect on this time as the beginning of his transformation, not just into a painter, but into a living artwork. He wasn't content to just put weirdness on canvas, he had to embody it. Every movement, every outfit, every sentence was a brushstroke in the gallery of his identity. Even as a teenager, he was practicing his public persona like other kids practice scales. If someone asked him what time it was, he'd probably answer, "Time is an illusion invented by pocket watches," and then demand applause. He wasn't interested in the normal path. He was already laying down banana peels across it. And here's the thing, he was talented. Beneath all the performative strangeness, the ego and the reincarnated sibling baggage, Salvador Dali could paint like a man possessed. Even his earliest work showed frightening levels of detail, balance and imagination. He didn't just want to be an artist, he wanted to be the artist, the singularity. the one name people would say while gesturing dramatically with both hands. And he succeeded. But it all began here. A small town in Spain, a confused identity, a family too haunted to be ordinary, and a boy who decided that being normal was far too boring to bother with. Because when your parents tell you that you're one of a kind, and possibly your own dead brother, you don't just grow up, you debut. Salvador Dali didn't just join the surrealist movement, he hijacked it, restyled it in rhinestones, and made himself the star of its most confusing parade float. If the movement was about exploring dreams, then Dali brought the dream journal, the costume changes, and the unsettling urge to kiss your own reflection. By the late 1920s, Dali had begun circling the orbit of Parisian avant-garde circles, where the surrealists, those cocktail-shaking intellectuals of the subconscious, were brewing up a storm of strain. These were artists and writers obsessed with dreams, free association, irrational logic, and anything that could yank the mind out of its orderly, miserable little box. Think Sigmund Freud meets modern art, with a heavy dose of did someone just paint an eyeball crying blood into a shoe. Enter Dali, stage left, wearing a cape and probably holding a cane that doubled as a butter knife. The surrealists, led by poet André Breton, were trying to access the unconscious mind, to rip apart the fabric of logic, and stitch it back together with nightmare thread. Dali, meanwhile, had already been mentally living in a Salvador-flavored dream for years. He was made for this movement, or rather, the movement was finally catching up to where he'd been operating since age 6. Dali quickly adopted the group's style, but injected it with theatrical lunacy, religious undertones and erotic confusion so intense it made Freud raise an eyebrow from across Europe. He coined a method for his art called the paranoiac critical method, which, in classic Dali fashion, sounds like something you'd need a prescription to manage. But what it boiled down to was this: imagine things until they get weird, and then paint them like you totally meant it. His magnum opus of weirdness, the painting that would catapult him from eccentric artist to living fever dream, was completed in 1931, The Persistence of Memory. Let's talk about that painting for a moment. You've definitely seen it. It's the one with the melting clocks draped over tree branches, tables, and some unidentifiable oozing object that looks like a sleeping pancake wearing eyelashes. The landscape is barren, eerie, and tinged with the silence of a dream you can't quite wake up from. Time isn't just stopped, it's drooping like it's given up entirely, and yet it's painted with razor-sharp realism. That was part of Dali's genius. He took surreal content and rendered it with the clarity of a microscope. The clocks may have the consistency of warm mozzarella, but they cast perfectly logical shadows. This technique gave his work the uncomfortable believability of a lucid dream, unreal things made to feel alarmingly real. So what's it all about? Time, decay, dreams, maybe camembert cheese. Dali never gave a single coherent explanation, and that was the point. Surrealism was meant to defy interpretation. He once claimed the melting clocks were inspired by camembert melting in the sun, which either tells us a lot about the painting or a lot about what was in his fridge that day. But under all the visual confusion, The Persistence of Memory is a deeply unnerving meditation on the way we experience time in dreams. Non-linear, slippery, and uncaring about your appointments. It's a reminder that reality is a fragile agreement, and Dali had already torn up the contract. And of course, we can't talk about this era without talking about Freud, Dali's intellectual spirit animal. Dali adored Freud. He saw him as the keymaster to the unconscious, the dream whisperer, the great explainer of why we sometimes want to marry our shoes. He read Freud obsessively and tried to turn every canvas into a visual Rorschach test, dripping with repressed desires and Catholic guilt. Oh yes, Catholic guilt. That was another ingredient in Dali's mind soup. Raised in a deeply religious household, Dali would spend much of his career doing the mental gymnastics of a man trying to blend sin, sainthood, and sex into one canvas. He was terrified of hell, obsessed with heaven, and deeply interested in what both looked like under a microscope. This volatile cocktail, dream logic, religious trauma, a dash of Freud and a side of dairy, made Dali the poster child of surrealism. While other surrealists played with abstraction or poetic symbolism, Dali went full theatre. His paintings weren't just surreal, they were psychologically loaded spectacles that made you question your grip on reality and your comfort with ants crawling out of objects that shouldn't have ants crawling out of them. And with the persistence of memory, Dali didn't just become a leader in the movement, he became its mascot. Even his face, with the iconic mustache now beginning to twist into sentient punctuation, became symbolic. Dali was surrealism, or at least the most marketable part of it. In the end, he didn't just paint dreams, he performed them, with melting time, wide eyes, and a dramatic bow, because if logic must be destroyed, it might as well be done by someone wearing an opera cloak. Salvador Dali didn't just create surrealist art, he weaponized confusion. While other artists were busy putting dreams on canvas, Dali was in the corner, gluing seafood to electronics and declaring war on furniture. His work didn't ask viewers to interpret it so much as survive it. And once you've seen a telephone topped with a lobster, your idea of a productive Tuesday will never be the same again. Let's start with the most infamous example of Dali-ness, the lobster telephone. Imagine, if you will, a perfectly ordinary 1930s black rotary phone. Heavy, functional, dull. Now replace the handset, the part you'd actually talk into, with a large red lobster. Not a drawing, not a sculpted approximation. An actual full-size lobster replica, delicately balanced where your ear and mouth would go. Dali insisted that lobsters and telephones had strong sexual connotations, which, while not a mainstream opinion, was very much a Dali opinion. He claimed the two objects shared a natural affinity, like peanut butter and existential dread. The lobster telephone became a surrealist icon, part phone, part seafood platter, part psychological trap, and it wasn't just a one-off. Dali made 6 different lobster telephones, because why stop at one when you're trying to reinvent modern communication as an anxiety buffet? Then there's the Mae West Lips sofa, perhaps the most glamorous piece of furniture in surrealism's bizarre living room. Dali designed the sofa based on the sultry lips of actress Mae West, turning a symbol of sensuality into something you could sit on, because naturally, when faced with a celebrity face, Dali's response was, "Can I upholster this?" The result is iconic, pouty, bright red, and somehow both elegant and deeply unsettling. Sitting on it feels like flirting with your furniture. And honestly, that's kind of the point. Dali believed objects weren't just objects, they were potential symbols, sensual triggers, Freudian puzzles, or maybe just weird jokes told through velvet. Which brings us to the real culinary chaos: bread. Dali didn't just eat bread, he wore it. He decorated with it. He had bread-themed art, bread-themed performances, and most famously, he once wore a loaf of bread as a hat during a lecture in Paris. Imagine being a respected art critic in 1936, showing up in your finest wool suit, only to be greeted by a man delivering a lecture on aesthetics while a French baguette slowly hardens on his head like a crouton crown. Was it a statement about consumption? About status? About religion? Maybe. Or maybe he just thought it looked fantastic with his mustache. Dali once said, "Good taste is the enemy of creativity," which is probably what you say when you've hot-glued breakfast to your skull, and it wasn't just bread. Dali once described his entire body as soft and edible, and he had a recurring obsession with food as symbolism. Eggs, snails, beans, you name it. His paintings often feature body parts blending into organic forms, a face melting into a drawer, a torso sprouting crutches, a leg turning into a lamp. He combined objects, people and snacks like he was running an IKEA designed by Freud on a sugar high. The thing is, Dali never saw these mashups as nonsense. For him, every absurd combination had meaning. His lobster wasn't just a crustacean, it was a metaphor. His bread hat wasn't just lunch, it was a crown of consumerism. Even his bizarre inventions were layered with emotional, political, or philosophical subtext. Or at least, that's what he said. It's entirely possible he just liked causing panic at art openings. But Dali's genius wasn't in the confusion, It was in owning the confusion. He didn't tiptoe around the line between brilliance and buffoonery. He sprinted across it, dressed as a bishop, riding a bicycle backwards while juggling eggs. And somehow it worked. It still works. To the average viewer, his creations may have looked like gibberish, but underneath the lobsters and furniture lips was a deep exploration of the human subconscious, how absurdity reflects reality more truthfully than order ever could. Dali didn't reject logic. He simply reassembled it into an origami swan and set it on fire. Critics, understandably, were divided. Some hailed him as a visionary, others assumed he'd inhaled too much turpentine, but everyone agreed on one thing: you couldn't ignore him. Dali made art that demanded a reaction, even if that reaction was just, wait, is that a bicycle made of bones? Because while most artists try to think outside the box, Dali had a different strategy. He set the box on fire, painted it blue, and married it in a symbolic wedding ceremony performed by a lobster priest. If Salvador Dali was the chaos, Gala was the calendar, and not a normal calendar. Think more along the lines of a pocket planner enchanted by a sorceress, who charges by the hour and occasionally disappears into the mountains for spiritual tax audits. Gala Eluard Dali, born Elena Ivanovna Diakonova, was Dali's wife, muse, business manager, and possibly the only person in the universe who could handle him without screaming into a pillow every 5 minutes. Their relationship began in 1929 when Dali met Gala while she was still married to the poet Paul Eluard, who, let's be honest, probably didn't expect his romantic competition to be a mustachioed Spaniard who painted clocks like mozzarella. But Gala saw something in Dali, and not just the artist, but the commodity. She didn't just fall in love with the man, she saw a brand, and promptly appointed herself CEO, and thus began one of the strangest partnerships in art history. Gala was older than Dali by 10 years, Russian by birth, and reportedly gifted with the ability to terrify people just by walking into a room. She had eyes like daggers and a mind like a Swiss vault. And Dali? He adored her, obsessively. He signed paintings with both their names, claiming they were two halves of the same divine madness. "It is mostly with your blood," he once said, "that I paint my pictures." Which sounds romantic, until you remember this is the same man who once painted a horse emerging from a chest of drawers. Love, in Dali speak, was never going to be subtle, but while he frothed at the canvas, Gala managed the empire. She arranged exhibitions, negotiated prices, answered correspondence, and most critically made sure Dali got paid. It's said she drove an infamously hard bargain with art dealers, ensuring Dali's moustache never curled for less than a healthy paycheck. In fact, it wasn't uncommon for her to increase the price of a painting during the negotiation, like a surrealist stock market made of ego and oil paint. This managerial style, part bulldozer, part crystal ball, earned her both admiration and ire. Some saw her as Dali's saving grace, the only force keeping his head from literally floating off into dreamland. Others thought she was manipulative, controlling, and motivated by money. Dali, however, never wavered. If anything, he put her on a higher pedestal than most deities. Gala wasn't just his partner, she was his obsession, his reason, and occasionally his tax write-off. Nowhere is the absurdity of their relationship more apparent than in the Pubble Castle incident. In 1968, Dali bought Gala a medieval castle in Catalonia, but here's the twist. He gave her the exclusive right to visit it without him, unless invited in writing. Yes, Dali was legally banned from his own wife's castle, unless she formally invited him like a vampire with an RSVP. You may love your spouse, but do you love them enough to build them a castle and then stay out of it? Of course, in Dali and Gala's world, this wasn't weird, it was romantic. For Dali, the space between them was sacred, a kind of emotional echo chamber where absence became admiration. For Gala, it was possibly just a really nice place to take naps away from melting clocks and moustache metaphors. But as much as she managed him, Gala also inspired him, fiercely. She appears in dozens of his paintings, sometimes angelic, sometimes terrifying, always powerful. In Galatea of the Spheres, her face explodes into molecular orbs. In the Madonna of Port Ligot, she's a divine figure floating through holes in her own body. She wasn't just a muse in the classical sense. She was Dali's personal religion, one he worshipped with oil paint, jewels, and obsessive devotion. The later years of their relationship grew, let's call it creatively flexible. Gala took lovers. Dali, ever the surrealist, didn't seem to mind, as long as he could keep painting her like she was made of sunlight and secrets. Their bond was less about fidelity and more about myth-building. They weren't husband and wife so much as living symbols. One the explosive artist, the other the unblinking oracle keeping the circus on schedule. Was Gala manipulative? Perhaps. Was she controlling? Absolutely. But was she also the structural integrity of Dali's entire chaotic life? Without question. Because Dali might have painted dreams, but Gala was the one who sold them, framed them, insured them, and occasionally hid them when the tax collectors came calling. She didn't just inspire his art. She organized it like a surreal calendar with receipts. By the time Salvador Dali arrived in America, he wasn't just an artist, he was an event. A walking, swirling, cane-twirling, mustache-pointing event. And if Europe had grown used to his surrealist oddities, the United States was about to get a full-blown Dali-nado straight to the face. The 1940s were a golden age for Hollywood, and Dali, ever the opportunist, saw something deeply surreal in the manic optimism of American showbiz. He arrived in New York in 1940, already famous, already ridiculous, and already plotting how to melt the entertainment industry the same way he melted clocks. And of course he didn't just knock on Hollywood's door, he kicked it open, riding an anteater. No, really, he once walked an actual anteater into a Paris lecture, but you just know he would have brought it to an MGM party if customs hadn't stopped him. One of Dali's most curious partnerships began with the House of Mouse. In 1945 he teamed up with Walt Disney to create an animated short called Destino. Yes, that's right. The king of surrealism and the king of talking mice attempted to make a cartoon together. The premise: a love story told through morphing landscapes, dancing figures, and dream logic. Basically, Dali turned in a storyboard that looked like a Picasso had eaten a tarot deck and sneezed. The project was abandoned due to budget concerns. Read, no one knew what was happening, but was eventually completed decades later in 2003 using Dali's original work. It's haunting, beautiful, and about as easy to explain as a dream involving your grandmother's toaster running for office. Dali called it a magical exposition of life in the labyrinth of time. Disney probably called it terrifying but weirdly elegant. Dali's other major Hollywood foray was with Alfred Hitchcock, who asked him to design a dream sequence for the 1945 psychological thriller Spellbound. And when Hitch wants weird, you deliver. Dali's dreamscape was textbook surrealism, giant eyeballs, melting scenery, and men with no faces. It was unsettling, symbolic, and perfect for a movie about guilt and the subconscious. Hitchcock said he wanted Dali because he didn't want the cliché of a dream, and no one did not cliché better than the man who once painted a woman with drawers for ribs. The final cut toned down some of Dali's more nightmarish ideas. There were reportedly more insects and fewer budget-friendly sets, but his fingerprints are unmistakable. Even in the most mainstream of venues, Dali bent reality like it was made of caramel. As his fame grew, Dali did something most serious artists of the time considered sacrilegious. He embraced mass media. He appeared on TV talk shows. He filmed ads for chocolate and brandy. He wrote articles with titles like "Why I Paint Dreams." He wasn't just selling art, he was selling Dali, and sell he did. In one commercial, Dali endorses Alka-Seltzer, claiming it soothes the stomach that paints the soul. We're still not sure if that's an actual slogan or a hex. His interviews became performance art. When asked by Dick Cavett what he thought of television, Dali replied, "It is very Dalinian." When asked what that meant, he gave no answer, just stared, moustache bristling, as if you'd just questioned the emotional capacity of a lobster. He wasn't there to be understood, he was there to be remembered. Of course, you couldn't talk about Dali in public life without addressing the wardrobe. Dali dressed like a man who had once bet a demon he could wear the entire century at once. His outfits included silk suits, floor-length capes, gem-studded canes, and occasionally diving suits. He wore one during a lecture and nearly suffocated, which only made the audience think it was part of the performance. In one particularly unforgettable moment, Dali entered a party dragging a small wooden cart filled with paintings and live animals, including, you guessed it, a leashed anteater. Because what else says hello Hollywood, like walking your exotic mammal through a hotel lobby? The truth is, Dali didn't just want fame. He treated fame as a medium like paint or bronze. He sculpted his identity in public, posed for cameras like they were confessionals, and danced on the line between genius and spectacle with absolute conviction. He wasn't just in the spotlight. He tried to marry the spotlight, then paint its dreams in gold leaf and let it borrow his cane. Critics accused him of selling out. Other surrealists, including André Breton, accused him of abandoning ideology for celebrity. They even gave him a nickname, Avida Dollars, an anagram of his name that roughly translates to eager for dollars. Dali, unfazed, probably embroidered it on a robe, because whether you loved him, loathed him, or just wanted to know why he brought an ocelot to dinner, Dali didn't just show up as a superstar. He turned it into his next canvas. If Salvador Dali's paintings were portals into dream logic, his mustache was the ticket booth. Sharp, unpredictable, and deeply committed to the performance. No other artist in history, maybe no other human, has used facial hair so deliberately, so theatrically, or with such unapologetic swagger. His mustache wasn't an accessory. It was a manifesto. It defied gravity. It defied explanation. It looked like a pair of insect legs attempting ballet. Dali's mustache was so aggressively styled that it could enter a room several seconds before he did. And if you thought that was by accident, you clearly didn't know Dali. He once said, "Since I don't smoke, I decided to grow a mustache. It's better for the health." That, in classic Dali form, is both completely irrational and somehow makes perfect sense. The mustache was more than a statement piece. It was a lifestyle, a boundary marker, a carefully curated slice of chaos pasted just below his nose. The style itself drew inspiration from the Spanish Baroque painter Diego Velázquez, who also wore his facial hair like a fencing duel waiting to happen. But while Velázquez had the courtesy to let his mustache obey the laws of physics, Dali turned his into a living sculpture, a surrealist topiary of bristles. It curled up at impossible angles, often waxed to knife points, sometimes forming wild geometric arcs like a compass had gone rogue across his face. And the maintenance? Obsessive. Dali didn't grow a mustache, he raised one. He groomed it like a bonsai tree with delusions of grandeur. His travel bags included mustache wax, miniature combs, and on more than one occasion custom tools designed to keep it sharp enough to open envelopes or terrify small children. He treated that patch of hair with more artistic reverence than most artists give their canvases. For Dali, it wasn't facial hair, it was architecture. The mustache became his signature, just as much as melting clocks or surreal dreamscapes. By the 1950s, you could identify Dali by silhouette alone. If his face was a theatre, the mustache was the chandelier, unnecessary, excessive, and absolutely essential. He posed with it like it had its own contract. It starred in interviews. It got its own fan mail. It once even got a Q&A with a journalist where Dali claimed it could predict the future. Again, he might have been joking, or not. And while it may seem ridiculous to dedicate this much cultural energy to 2 wisps of hair, Dali himself understood something powerful. In art, nothing is too small to become iconic if you believe in it hard enough. His mustache was performance art on a molecular level. While others painted with oils, he was busy styling his face into a living brand. There's a delightful absurdity in how seriously he took it. In one famous anecdote, a TV host asked him if his mustache had ever gone out of fashion. Dali blinked once, slowly, then replied, "No, my mustache is the fashion." That wasn't arrogance, that was faith. Dali didn't see his mustache as part of his image, he saw it as part of his cosmic identity. And let's be honest, it worked. Today, when people parody surrealism, they draw the mustache first. There are coffee mugs shaped like it, t-shirts, phone cases, waxing kits probably named after it. It's become as instantly recognizable as Einstein's hair or Frida Kahlo's brow. Not just because it was odd, but because Dali turned it into a visual signature with gravitational pull. Even in his later years, when many artists start to blend into their own retrospectives, Dali's mustache kept performing. In his final TV appearances, frail but flamboyant, he still wore it like a crown. It drooped a little, sure, but so does every flag in still air. The message was the same. I am still here, and I am still strange. When Dali died in 1989, his mustache didn't go quietly either. In fact, when his body was exhumed in 2017 during a bizarre paternity case, the forensic experts noted with stunned reverence that Dali's mustache had perfectly preserved its shape. The man had been gone nearly 3 decades, and still his mustache was curled to attention like it refused to accept death until it had a proper curtain call. In the end, Dali's mustache outlived the surrealist movement, his critics, and most of his collaborators. It became the final flourish of a man who turned every part of himself into art, even the parts most people just shave off before job interviews. Because Dali didn't believe in just being an artist, he believed in becoming your own artwork. And if that meant sculpting a mustache so sharp it could pierce time itself, then so be it. Salvador Dali spent his whole life trying to cheat death, not necessarily by living forever, but by making sure his weirdness would. And judging by the fact that we're still talking about his lobster telephones, gravity-defying mustache, and furniture inspired by women's faces, he absolutely succeeded. Dali didn't just want to leave a mark on the world. He wanted to brand it, confuse it, and maybe tattoo a snail on it for good measure. By the 1980s, Dali had slowed down physically, but his obsession with immortality ramped up like a dream sequence on espresso. He started fixating on death, religion, and eternal life. He became increasingly reclusive after the death of Gala, the muse manager oracle of his life. But even in solitude, he stayed Dali, always calculating how to turn mortality into another art installation. He famously said, "I do not believe in my death," which sounds ridiculous, until you realize that he made it his final performance piece. When he finally died in 1989 at the age of 84, Dali didn't just get buried, he got entombed inside his own museum. Yes, that's right, you can visit the Dali Theatre Museum in Figueres, Spain, and walk over the exact spot where Dali's body lies, beneath a domed stage in a building designed like a fever dream wearing lipstick. Most artists hang their work in museums. Dali, he haunts his. And let's not gloss over this museum. The Dali Theatre Museum is a riot of red walls, giant eggs, mannequins in bathtubs, and exhibits that look like your subconscious got drunk and rearranged IKEA. There's a car inside that rains on you when you open it. There are paintings that turn into faces when viewed from the right angle. And of course there's Dali himself buried in the middle of all of it, like the world's most committed museum exhibit. But what's most striking isn't just that his body is in a museum. It's that his presence never really left pop culture at all. Dali's legacy is a living, breathing organism. It's in advertising, music videos, fashion runways, and movie sets. Every time you see a surreal visual gag, a Dream Logic commercial, or an ad that makes you go, "Wait, what just happened?" You're seeing Dali's fingerprints smeared across the subconscious of the 21st century. He even managed to invade the internet, decades before it existed. Dali once said, "The only difference between me and a madman is that I'm not mad." But honestly, that's the kind of tweet that would get retweeted by 50 different art meme pages today. He was born to go viral. He just had to wait for technology to catch up. His face shows up on more GIFs than some living celebrities. His quotes are all over Pinterest boards and Tumblr accounts titled things like Dream Logic and Drama Queens. His work has been parodied on The Simpsons, referenced by Kanye West, and mimicked in music videos by artists from Madonna to Coldplay. His paintings inspired entire levels in video games, and his surreal approach to reality basically the blueprint for modern meme culture. Because Dali didn't just paint surrealism, he lived it. And in the era of chaotic TikToks, algorithm-fueled dream content and YouTube videos about nothing that somehow get 2 million views, it's safe to say Dali would have felt right at home online. If Dali were alive today, he'd live-stream dream analyses where guests were handed symbolic fruit and asked to interpret their childhood trauma through interpretive dance and mustache grooming. And of course, he'd be constantly accused of being an AI-generated prank, which would probably delight him beyond measure. But for all the absurdity, the memes and the melting objects, Dali's true legacy is emotional. He gave people permission to be strange with purpose, to treat dreams as sacred and fears as art supplies. He showed that madness and genius aren't opposites. They're neighbors who borrow sugar from each other. He taught us that you can wear a bread hat, talk to lobsters, fear grasshoppers, and still be a master of form, color, and idea. In a world increasingly obsessed with explaining everything, Dali is a comforting reminder that some things are better left weird. He once said, "What is important is to spread confusion, not eliminate it." And that right there, that's the most Dali thing of all. Because while most artists left behind paintings, Dali left behind an operating system for how to exist in a world that rarely makes sense. And like his mustache preserved in perfect form long after his death, Dali's spirit hasn't gone anywhere. It's just waiting around the corner, melting clocks and whispering something vaguely philosophical into the internet's collective ear.